Gideon Bellamy didn't even look up from the fire when he said it. He sat in the leather chair that had been her father's. Her father's with a glass of whiskey balanced on his knee and a document spread across the arm of the chair like it was nothing more than a grocery list. His attorney stood beside him, hands folded, watching Mara the way a man watches an animal that hasn't yet understood the cage door has closed. "Sign it," Gideon said. Mara looked at the paper. Then she looked at the man who had carried her father's casket 6 weeks ago, who had wept at the grave, who had held her hand and told her everything was going to be all right. "That's not my father's signature," she said. Gideon finally looked at her, and he smiled. That smile, not cruel, not angry, just utterly patient, was the moment Mara Bellamy understood that she was already supposed to have lost. The last thing you owned in the world was the truth, and no one around you was willing to believe it. What would you do? Before we go any further, if a story like this speaks to something in you, the kind that doesn't let go until the last word, then take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. And when you've settled in, drop a comment telling me your city or country, because I want to know how far this story travels. Every name in that comment section reminds me why we tell these stories in the first place. Now let's go back to Wyoming, and to a woman who refused to become someone's footnote. The winter of 1886 came down hard on Wyoming territory and didn't apologize for it. By early December, the passes were already swallowed, the cattle had been driven close, and the kind of cold that settled into the high country wasn't the kind that bit, it was the kind that pressed. Slow patient. It didn't attack a body, it just waited. Mara Bellamy had spent most of her 24 years on the Bellamy Ranch, 12 miles outside of town, too small to have a proper doctor and too proud to admit it. She knew cold. She knew hard winters and short harvests, and the specific silence that fell over a house when money was tight and no one wanted to say so out loud. She had grown up with calluses on her hands before most girls her age had finished their schooling, and she had never once considered that a failure. Her father, Thomas Bellamy, had built that ranch from a single deed and a lot of stubbornness. He used to say the land didn't care how much money you had, it cared how much you showed up. Mara had believed him. She still believed him, even now, 5 weeks after they had put him in the ground. What she had not believed, not until tonight, was that his brother was capable of this. She stood in the parlor of the house she had grown up in and stared at the document Gideon's attorney, a man named Victor Voss, had slid across the table to her. The paper looked official. It had notary seals, witness signatures, ink that had dried to a proper faded brown. Claimed that Thomas Bellamy had transferred ownership of the ranch to his brother, Gideon Bellamy, 18 months before his death, in consideration of debts owed. Thomas Bellamy had owed his brother nothing. Mara knew every ledger entry in this house. She had helped her father keep the books since she was 14 years old. She knew the ranch's debts the way she knew her own face in a mirror, every crack, every worry, every line that had been smoothed down through hard work and careful management. There were no debts to Gideon. There had never been debts to Gideon. "The signature is forged," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Mr. Voss made a small, patient sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. He was a trim man, well-dressed for the territory, with the careful manners of someone who had learned long ago that appearing reasonable was more effective than appearing threatening. "Miss Bellamy, I understand this is a difficult time. The document was notarized by a sitting official. I don't care who notarized it. My father didn't sign it." She looked at her uncle. "You know he didn't sign it." Gideon swirled his whiskey. The fire popped. "Your father was not a well man in his final months," Gideon said. "He said it the way you'd say. The weather was poor as a fact, slightly regrettable, nothing to be done about it. He made decisions he may not have fully remembered making. It's not fraud, Mara. That's just age. He was 53 years old. He was sick. He was your brother." Something shifted in Gideon's face then, not guilt. Not even discomfort, just a slight recalibration, like a man adjusting his grip on something he intends to keep holding. "Yes," he said, "he was, and I'm trying to settle his affairs as cleanly as possible for both our sakes. Sign the acknowledgement, take the monthly allowance we're offering, and you can stay in this house through the spring." Through the spring, as if she were a tenant, as if her father's blood in this ground meant nothing more than a temporary arrangement. Mara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She looked at the paper again. She looked at the signature, her father's name, Thomas H. Bellamy, written in a hand that was close but not exact. She had read her father's handwriting her entire life. The loop of the B was wrong. The crossing of the T in Thomas sat too high. Small things. Things you'd only catch if you'd spent years watching a man sign his name to feed orders and land agreements and letters to banks. I need time to review this, she said. Gideon nodded graciously. Of course. Victor will return in 3 days. We'd like the matter settled before the new year. She nodded. She said good night. She walked down the hall to the room that had been hers since childhood, closed the door, and stood in the dark for a long time. Then she moved. She knew exactly where her father kept the real ledgers. Thomas Bellamy had not been a complicated man, but he had been a careful one. When Mara was 16, he had shown her the false panel at the bottom of the wardrobe in his study, not because he expected trouble, he'd said, but because a man who doesn't make provisions for trouble is a man who hasn't been paying attention. Behind that panel, a metal strongbox. Inside the strongbox, the ranch's original deed, the signed and witnessed will that Thomas had filed 2 years before his illness, and the private ledger that tracked every significant financial transaction of the past decade. Mara took all of it. She also took her coat, her heaviest boots, her father's pocket watch, and $43. She had kept folded inside the lining of her traveling bag since summer, savings from the eggs and butter she'd sold to the trading post in town, money she'd told no one about, not because she was hiding it, but because it was hers. She did not take a horse. The horses were stabled on the far side of the property, and getting to them meant crossing an open yard in full view of the bunkhouse where 2 of Gideon's men had been sleeping since last week. She had noticed them arrive. She had not said anything, because she had not yet understood what they meant. She understood now. The door at the back of the kitchen opened silently. She had oiled the hinges herself in September. She stepped outside into the dark. Cold hit her like a wall. The temperature had been dropping all evening and was now somewhere far below anything comfortable, and the wind was picking up from the northwest, the direction that meant serious. Weather was moving in behind it. She could hear it in the way the air pressed against her ears, in the way the few bare cottonwoods at the edge of the yard had gone from swaying to creaking. She started walking. She didn't have a plan, not a good one. She had a direction town and a vague knowledge of the road, and the absolute certainty that if she stayed in that house tonight, those documents would disappear before morning. Victor Voss hadn't come all the way from Cheyenne to take no for an answer. She'd seen it in the way he watched her hands when she'd touched the transfer paper, cataloging whether she intended to fight. She intended to fight. She just needed to survive long enough to do it. The road was harder to find than she expected. The snow that had fallen 2 days ago had drifted across the tracks, and without the sun there was no easy way to distinguish the road from the frozen fields on either side of it. She walked by feel, by memory, by the way her feet met ground that was slightly more packed than the open range beside it. She had gone perhaps half a mile when she heard the horses. Not in front of her, behind. She stepped sideways off the track and dropped into the shadow of a snow-covered fence line and didn't breathe. 2 riders, moving from the direction of the house, lanterns swinging, moving at a pace that wasn't casual, moving like men who'd been told to look for something. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she changed direction. There was a boy, a stable hand named Pete, 14 years old and quiet in the way of children, who've learned that staying quiet keeps them out of trouble. He slept in the tack room off the main stable, which was separate from the bunkhouse. Mara had brought him food twice in the last week because she'd noticed Gideon's men weren't feeding him properly. She found the stable. She found Pete awake, sitting up in his blankets, listening to the same wind she'd been fighting. "Miss Bellamy?" He squinted at her in the darkness. "You're not supposed to be out here, I know." She knelt down so she wasn't looming over him. "I need directions, not to town around it. There's a ranch to the northeast up in the ridge country. A man named Mercer. Do you know it?" Pete chewed his lip. "Cole Mercer's place? You know him? My daddy bought a horse from him once. Said he was all right. Quiet." Pete thought for a moment. "It's a long way in this weather, Miss Bellamy." "I know." He looked at her face for a long moment, at the strongbox tucked under her arm, at the coat she'd wrapped tight against herself, at whatever it was in her expression that made him stop asking follow-up questions. He was 14. He'd already seen enough of the world to know what a person looks like when they're out of options. He told her everything he knew, the ridge line to follow, the creek to stay left of, the stand of pine that meant she was getting close. He told her it was maybe 8 miles, maybe more in the drifts. He told her there was a light Mercer kept burning on the south side of the house when he was home, because the approach to his property came through a blind bend, and he'd had visitors nearly kill themselves on his fence post once. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Bellamy." He caught her sleeve. "If you don't make it, I'll make it." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because he didn't need her doubt. She gave his hand a brief squeeze, the way she might squeeze the hand of a younger brother, if she'd had one. And then she stepped back out into the dark. The wind had worsened. She lost count of the times she fell. The drifts were unpredictable, knee-deep in one step, solid ground in the next, and then shin-deep again with no warning. Her heaviest boots had not been built for 8 miles of this, and she could feel the cold working its way through the leather before she'd gone 2 miles past the stable. She thought about her father. Not in the sentimental way that grief usually arrives, not the soft, blurred memories, but sharply. Specifically, the way he'd taught her to read a ledger entry, how he'd explained the difference between debt of record and debt of word, how he'd said, Mara, if a man wants to take something from you, first thing he does is convince you that you never really had it. She hadn't known what he meant when she was 12. She knew exactly what he meant now. She thought about the transfer document, about the signature she'd recognized as wrong, about the notary seal that Gideon and Victor had clearly arranged with someone in their pocket. They had built a convincing enough forgery to survive a casual examination, but they had not built it to survive someone who had read her father's handwriting 5,000 times. She had the real ledger. She had the real will. She just needed somewhere to put herself until she could use them. The snow began properly around the 3rd mile, or what she estimated was the 3rd mile, though distance had become unreliable in the dark and the cold. Not the light, polite snow that came before a storm settled in, but the real kind, heavy and sideways, the kind that filled the air so thoroughly that her lantern, she'd taken the small one from the tack room. She wasn't entirely reckless, barely lit the ground 2 feet ahead of her. She fell again. Her knee hit something hard beneath the snow, and she went down hard on her hands, and the strongbox slid several feet before she caught the strap. She knelt there for a moment, breathing hard, her hands shaking, and thought about staying down, thought about Gideon's smile. She got up. The creek Pete had told her about appeared on her left, frozen solid, gleaming faintly in what little light the clouds reflected back at the ground. Kept it on her left. She kept walking. Her feet had stopped hurting somewhere around mile 4, which she understood, distantly, was not a good sign, but it was information she filed away rather than examined, because there was nothing to do about it right now except keep moving. Pine stand appeared when she had almost stopped, expecting it. She almost walked into the fence post before she saw the light. It was a small light, an oil lamp burning in a south-facing window, and it was the most significant thing she had seen in 4 hours. She pushed through the last stretch of drifted snow with something that wasn't quite energy. Her body had stopped having energy, but was adjacent to it. Something that operated on a different system than muscle. Something that didn't have a proper name. She reached the door. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder with the side of her fist, because her fingers weren't working properly. Behind the door, she heard movement slow at first, then quicker, the sound of someone who was not expecting company and not particularly happy about the prospect of it. The door opened. Cole Mercer was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of being readable at first glance. He was holding a rifle not raised, just held, the way a man holds something out of long habit rather than immediate intention. His hair was dark and badly in need of cutting. His expression in that first second was closed and flat and entirely unwelcoming. He looked at her. He looked at the strong box under her arm. He looked at her hands, which she realized were shaking visibly in the lamplight. I'm not a threat, she said, and the words came out fractured because her jaw had been clenching against the cold for so long that speaking normally required an effort she barely had. I just need one night. I just need one night. I can pay. She stopped talking because she'd run out of the particular kind of momentum that had been carrying her since the tack room. Cole Mercer stood in his doorway for a moment, looking at her with an expression that she couldn't quite read, not warmth, not hostility, something more complicated than either. He looked past her, into the dark and the snow, as if checking whether she was alone. Apparently satisfying himself on that point, he looked back at her face. She was aware in some distant way that she probably looked like something the storm had kicked across the range. Her hair was mostly ice. Her coat was soaked through on the shoulders. She was shaking hard enough that she was surprised she couldn't hear her own teeth. She didn't say anything else. She was out of words. He stepped back from the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just opened the door wider and moved aside. And that single wordless gesture, that slight shift of one man's body to let her through was, Mara would think later, The first moment in this entire terrible night that anyone had acted simply on the evidence of what they could see in front of them. She walked in. The warmth of the room hit her like something physical, and she would have gone to her knees if the wall hadn't been there. She pressed her back against it and slid down to sitting and held the strongbox across her chest with both arms and tried to remember how to breathe without it hurting. Cole closed the door against the storm. He went to the fire and added wood without speaking. Then he went somewhere else. In the house, she heard him moving, heard water, heard the particular sounds of someone doing practical things with deliberate quiet, and came back with a blanket, which he dropped over her shoulders from a careful distance, the way you'd approach something you weren't sure about. "Thank you," she said. He grunted. It wasn't unfriendly. It wasn't anything. It was simply an acknowledgement that she had spoken. She looked at him. He'd set the rifle against the wall, not out of arm's reach, she noticed, but no longer in his hand. He was standing by the fire now, looking into it with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man running an internal calculation he hadn't yet finished. "I said one night," she told him, because she needed him to understand she wasn't asking for more. She'd already asked for more than she was comfortable with just by being here. "Tomorrow I'll be out of your way." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fire for another moment, then at the strongbox in her arms, then briefly at her face. "Where are you trying to get to?" he said. His voice was low and rough with disuse, the voice of someone who didn't spend much time talking. "Cheyenne." The word landed in the room and sat there. She watched something move across his expression, not alarm exactly, but a recalibration. Cheyenne was not one night. Cheyenne was days of hard riding in good weather, and this was not good weather, and she had arrived on foot. "In this?" he said. "Not tonight," she said. "Tomorrow." Another silence. Fire snapped and threw light across the rough walls of the room, and Mara sat against the wall with her father's entire legacy pressed against her chest and tried to look like a woman who had a reasonable plan, which she mostly did not. Cole Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the fire. "Sleep," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." Mara didn't agree or disagree. She was already losing the fight to stay conscious. The warmth and the sudden stillness and the sheer exhaustion of 4 hours in a Wyoming blizzard were all working against her, now that she'd stopped moving, and the last thing she clearly remembered before her eyes closed was the sound of wind beating against the walls of a stranger's house, and the strange, disorienting sensation of feeling, against all reasonable evidence, safe. She didn't let go of the strongbox, not even in her sleep. Outside, the storm pressed down on the ridge like something that had made up its mind. Snow deepened. The tracks she had made, across 8 miles of open country, filled in and disappeared. By morning, there would be no trace of where she'd come from. But the ledger was real. The will was real. And somewhere behind her, in the house her father had built, Gideon Bellamy was going to open a false panel at the bottom of a wardrobe and find nothing but empty space. That moment, the moment he understood what she had done, was still a few hours away. Mara slept through the storm with her father's truth locked in her arms, in the home of a man she didn't know. With everything she had left riding on one question, she wouldn't be able to answer until morning, whether a man who had opened his door to a stranger in the dark would be willing to do something harder than that. She didn't know Cole Mercer. She didn't know that he had lost a wife to this same kind of cold, in this same ridge country, years ago, that he had carried that knowledge so long, it had become part of the structure of him, the way scar tissue becomes part of skin. She didn't know that he had been alone out here long enough that the silence had stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like protection. She didn't know that, when he'd stepped back from the doorway tonight, it had cost him something, even if he couldn't have named the price. And he didn't know that the woman sleeping against his wall, shaking, soaked through, stubborn enough to walk 8 miles through a blizzard, rather than sign a lie, was going to be the most disruptive thing to enter his life in years. Neither of them knew anything yet. That was what morning was for. She was already awake when the light changed. Not because she'd slept well. She hadn't slept well. She'd slept the way a person sleeps when their body has given out and their mind hasn't fully agreed to it yet, but because the quality of the silence in the room shifted sometime before dawn, and Mara Bellamy had grown up in a house where silence meant something. Silence before a storm meant one thing. Silence after a storm meant another. The silence in Cole Mercer's house that morning had a specific texture to it. The kind that came when snow had stopped falling and the world outside had gone absolutely still. She opened her eyes. The strongbox was still in her arms. Coat had dried stiff on the peg by the door where someone Cole had moved it without waking her. Her boots were near the fire, standing upright, the leather beginning to loosen from the heat. She didn't remember any of that being done. She'd been unconscious enough that a man she didn't know had moved within arm's reach of her several times and she hadn't stirred. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She got to her feet carefully. Her knee, where she'd hit it on whatever was buried under the snow last night, had stiffened overnight and sent a sharp, unpleasant report up her leg when she stood. She breathed through it. The room was warmer than it had any right to be. The fire still going banked low, but maintained, which meant Cole had been up at some point to tend it. She heard him before she saw him, movement in what she assumed was the kitchen, the particular sounds of a man who has cooked alone long enough that he no longer makes noise about it. She found him standing at a wood stove with a pan of something that smelled like salt pork and coffee that smelled like it would correct several of last night's mistakes. He didn't turn around when she came in, but he'd set 2 cups on the table so he'd heard her. "Coffee's done," he said. She sat down and poured it herself, which seemed to be the expected thing. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let the heat move through her palms and tried to find the right way to start what needed to be said. There wasn't a right way, she just started. "My uncle forged my father's signature on a land transfer document," she said. "He's been falsifying the ranch ledgers for at least a year. He has an attorney, Victor Voss, out of Cheyenne, who's helped him build enough paperwork to make it look legitimate. If I don't get to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne and file my father's real will and the original ledger before Voss can have the estate frozen, I lose everything." She paused. "That's why I'm here. That's all of it." Cole turned from the stove. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her last night, not unkindly, but carefully, the way you look at something when you're deciding whether what you're seeing is what it appears to be. He brought the pan to the table and set it down between them without a word. "How long do you have?" he said. "Voss told my uncle he'd return in 3 days to get the signed acknowledgement. When I'm not there and the documents are gone, they'll know what I've done. Voss will ride for Cheyenne immediately." She looked at her coffee. "I have maybe 2 days before he can get an injunction filed. Maybe less if he telegraphs ahead." Cole sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He ate steadily, without apparent hurry, and she had the impression this was not a man given to hurried decisions, which was both reassuring and maddening given the circumstances. "How did you end up here?" he said. "Pete, the stable boy from my father's ranch. He gave me directions." Cole's expression shifted slightly. "You walked here in that storm. I didn't have a horse I could get to quietly." He set his fork down. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down, not a challenging look, but a measuring one. Like a man rechecking numbers he thought he'd already tallied. She held it without flinching. "Why Mercer's Ranch?" he said. "Pete could have told you to go to town. Town is 12 miles in the other direction. And 2 of my uncle's men were riding the road toward town when I left." She paused. "Also, Pete said you were all right." Cole picked up his fork again. "Pete's 14, he was the most reliable opinion available at midnight." Something moved in Cole's face at that, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, brief and involuntary, gone before it had fully arrived. He finished his coffee. "The roads are bad," he said. "I know, 2 days is tight even without them being bad. I know that too." He stood up and carried his plate to the wash bucket and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She watched him and waited and tried not to press, because she had the distinct sense that pressing this man was the wrong approach. He moved at his own pace, thought at his own pace, and whatever he was working through right now, he needed to work through in his own way. "I'll take you," he said. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without prelude, as if the decision had been made somewhere internal and he was only now informing the air about it. Mara sat very still for a moment. "You don't know me," she said. "No, I might be lying. You might be." He turned around. "You're not." She didn't ask how he knew. She wasn't sure she could have explained it herself, the particular clarity of someone who has nothing left to obscure. She had shown up at his door with nothing but the truth and the evidence to back it up, and the kind of desperation that doesn't have the energy to be anything other than honest. "I can pay you," she said. "Don't worry about that now. I'm going to worry about it, then worry about it later." He moved toward the door, pulling his coat from the peg. "We leave in an hour. Dress as warm as you can with what you have. The pass through the ridge will be rough snows deep up there, but it's faster than the main road, and the main road is where anyone looking for you will ride." She stood up. Her knee protested. She ignored it, Cole. She stopped him before he reached the door. Turned. "Why?" she said. "You don't owe me anything." He looked at her for a moment, with that unreadable, weathered expression, and she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I know what it looks like when someone's been left with nothing to work with but the facts. Seems like a waste to let that amount to nothing. He opened the door and went out into the morning cold to saddle the horses. Mara stood in the kitchen of a stranger's house, holding a strong box full of her father's truth, and thought that she was either very lucky or very far out, on a branch whose strength she couldn't measure. She didn't have enough information to know which. She went to get her boots. The first hour of riding was brutal in the way that physical difficulty is brutal before your body resigns itself to the fact that it's happening regardless. Slow acceptance measured in small distances. Cole had given her the better horse, a big steady gray he called Remnant, which she hadn't asked about. Her own saddle situation was an adjustment, because Remnant was wider than any horse she'd regularly ridden, and her knee made mounting a project the first time, but she managed it without asking for help, and Cole, to his credit, appeared not to notice. They didn't talk much in that first hour. The landscape demanded attention. The drifts had reshaped everything overnight. Familiar shapes buried or displaced, and the ridge trail Cole was navigating was not a trail in any conventional sense. It was a line of reasoning, a path that existed, because someone who knew the land well enough had decided it could exist. Cole rode ahead, reading the ground in some way she couldn't fully replicate, occasionally stopping to check something she didn't see, then moving again. Cold was clean this morning rather than hostile. Storm had burned itself out and left behind a blue sky that felt almost too bright, the kind of light that reflects off snowfields and makes your eyes work harder than usual. Kept the strong box secured against her body inside her coat. She was aware of it constantly. Around mid-morning, Cole dropped back beside her on a stretch where the terrain leveled enough to ride parallel. "Tell me about Voss," he said. She was surprised he asked, and then realized she shouldn't be. A man who decides to ride into trouble usually wants to know the shape of it first. Victor Voss. She thought about how to compress it. He's been my uncle's attorney for at least 4 years. He's from Cheyenne originally. He has connections in the land office, in the territorial court system, probably with the notary offices. He's the kind of man who is always polite and never wrong, and is very skilled at making other people feel like the problem is with their understanding rather than with his honesty. She paused. Smart. He anticipated that I might contest the document, which is why they had it notarized. He's also the one who suggested the monthly allowance offer. That was his idea, too structured to be my uncle's. Why do you say that? Because my uncle's instinct would be to tell me to be grateful and stop asking questions. The allowance offer is more careful than that. It's something designed to look generous enough that if I refused it, a judge might later see me as unreasonable. She watched the trail ahead. Voss thinks about how things will look later. He's not just handling today's problem. He's managing how the story reads if it ever goes to court. Cole absorbed this. And the ledger you have it contradicts the transfer document? Completely. My father's own entries show no debt to Gideon at any point in the last 10 years. Not a dollar. And the will, the legitimate will, was filed with my father's attorney in Casper 2 years before he died. If we can get that will before the court and have it verified against the forged transfer, Gideon's entire claim falls apart. She hesitated. Assuming Voss doesn't find a way to have the legitimate will invalidated before we can get it into the record. Can he do that? If he gets to Cheyenne first and files the right paperwork with someone sympathetic, he can delay everything long enough for the estate to be formally assigned. Once it's assigned, contesting it becomes a much longer fight. She pulled her coat tighter with one hand, which is why we can't let him get there first. Cole nodded slowly. He looked at the middle distance ahead of them, calculating something. "We'll stop in Redbird tonight," he said. "Small settlement about 4 hours further. I know a family there. We can get shelter, rest the horses, and push for Cheyenne at first light. Still gives us time? If nothing goes wrong?" "Yes," he glanced at her. "Things are going to go wrong. I know. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just things are going to go wrong, Cole." She met his eyes. "I walked 8 miles in a blizzard with a busted knee to avoid signing a forged document. I'm aware that this is not going to be simple." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the trail. "Fair enough," he said. They rode on. The trouble started at the creek crossing. Creek Pete had told her to stay left of the night before was, in daylight, a frozen channel about 12 feet across, and under normal conditions would have been nothing horses crossed frozen creeks without particular drama all the time. But the temperature had dropped fast after the storm cleared, and what had been moving water as recently as yesterday had frozen unevenly, with a layer of new ice over older, unreliable ice beneath it, and a dusting of snow over the top that made the whole surface look uniform and trustworthy when it wasn't. Cole tested it on foot first, which she appreciated, moving across carefully with a branch in hand. He made it across, turned, and waved her forward. She started across on Remnant. The horse felt it before she did that slight hesitation, a shift of weight, ears pricking forward at something and the sound of the ice beneath the hooves. She felt the surface give slightly and pulled up, but Remnant had already started to compensate, and the correction put them sideways on the crossing. And for 3 very long seconds she was managing a large horse that wasn't sure of its footing on uncertain ice while she couldn't fully use her right leg, and was holding a strong box inside her coat that absolutely could not drop into a frozen creek. Freeze. That was the thing she noticed later. She didn't freeze. She just made rapid small decisions in sequence, shifting her weight forward and giving Remnant his head, letting him find his own route across rather than trying to direct him. He lunged the last 4 feet, and they came off the ice onto solid bank with a jarring impact that sent pain shooting up from her knee, and then they were across, and she was breathing very hard. Cole was beside her immediately. He put a hand on Remnant's neck, steadying the horse, and looked up at her. "All right?" "Yes." She was breathing through her nose, controlled, steadying herself. "The ice has a soft layer underneath the new freeze. I felt it. I should have looked harder before I waved you across." He stepped back from the horse. "I'm sorry." She looked at him, because men who just watched a situation go sideways did not, in her experience, generally lead with, "I'm sorry," when they could lead with an explanation of why it wasn't really their fault. Surprised her enough that she didn't have an immediate answer. "We're both across," she said. "That's what matters." He didn't argue with that, but the set of his mouth said he'd filed the moment away as his error and intended to not repeat it. They moved on. The day wore toward afternoon, and with it came the particular exhaustion of sustained cold, the kind that doesn't announce itself clearly, but accumulates in the muscles, in the face, in the narrowing of focus that happens when your body is spending too much energy on simply maintaining temperature. Mara ate what she had, a heel of bread from Cole's kitchen that she'd accepted without ceremony, and drank from the canteen he passed to her without comment, and kept writing. She was thinking about her father, not in a way she could have articulated cleanly. It was more a presence than a thought, the weight of understanding, somewhere around the 4th hour of writing, that the reason she was out here in the cold with a busted knee and a stranger was that her father had spent 30 years building something and had trusted that the people around him were what they appeared to be. He had trusted Gideon. He'd been wrong about Gideon in a way that would have broken him, she thought, if he'd lived to find out. But he hadn't lived to find out. She had. And that meant the weight of it fell to her, not just the legal fight, not just the paperwork, but the specific grief of learning that someone who had held her at her father's funeral had been calculating what he needed to take before the casket was in the ground. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the night her father died, not in a way that lasted. She wasn't sure she had the mechanism for it right now, which was probably useful and also probably something she'd have to reckon with later. They reached Redbird at dusk. It wasn't much a trading post, a cluster of maybe 7 or 8 structures, a livery stable that was half collapsed on one side, but apparently still operational. The family Cole knew turned out to be a husband and wife named Frank and Della Oakes, a couple in their 50s who kept a boarding house that was really just their house with 2 extra rooms and a practical approach to hospitality. Della Oakes had the manner of a woman who had seen enough situations to have stopped being surprised by them, which meant she registered Cole arriving with an unknown woman and a visible urgency, and simply showed them where to put the horses and told them supper was in an hour. Mara was grateful for the absence of questions. Over supper, Frank Oakes mentioned offhandedly the way a man mentions weather that a rider had come through heading east about 2 hours ahead of them. Well-dressed man, polished coat, on a fresh horse. Hadn't stopped, hadn't spoken to anyone except to ask which road went through to the eastern pass. Cole and Mara exchanged a look across the table. "How far would he be now?" Cole said. Frank thought about it. "That road's rough past Redbird. Even a fresh horse won't make better time than 8-10 miles an hour in these conditions. He's maybe 15-18 miles ahead." He looked between them. "That a problem for you folks?" "We'll need to leave before first light," Cole said. Frank nodded. He didn't ask anything else. After supper, Mara sat by the fire in the small room Della had given her, and opened the strongbox for the first time since she'd fled the ranch. She spread the documents on the blanket and went through them carefully in the firelight, accounting for everything, verifying that nothing had been damaged by the cold or the creek crossing. The ledger was intact. The will was intact. The original deed was intact. She held the will for a long time. Her father's signature at the bottom, she recognized it completely, every loop and angle of it, the slight leftward lean of his capital letters, the way he wrote the Y in Bellamy, with a tail that dropped below the line. Unmistakably him. It was also, she realized for the first time, witnessed by two names she recognized: Elias Rook, who had been her father's attorney in Casper for 15 years, and a woman named Margaret Holt, who had worked in Rook's office. There was an attorney of record. They could get this document in front of the land office before Voss's injunction, and if Elias Rook would testify to having witnessed it, that was not a small if, because Rook was old and the territory in winter was not an easy place to move through. Then Gideon's entire claim rested on a forged signature against a witnessed, professionally filed original. She sat with that knowledge and let it arrange itself in her mind. Then she put everything carefully back in the strongbox, latched it, and set it beside her on the floor, where she'd feel it if anyone moved it. She thought about Cole sitting on the other side of the house, in whatever room Della had given him. She thought about the fact that he had agreed to this without being asked a second time, had ridden all day without complaint, had apologized for the creek without being pressed to, and had spent the evening talking to Frank Oakes with a quietness that seemed to be less about coldness and more about the specific efficiency of a man who didn't use words as filler. She didn't know what to do with him, quite. He didn't fit any category she had available. She fell asleep with her hand on the strongbox. Cole woke her at 4 in the morning. He knocked twice on the door quiet and said her name once. She was up and dressed and outside in 7 minutes, which she could tell marginally surprised him, though he didn't say so. They were on the road before the sky had decided what color it intended to be. The Eastern Pass was everything Cole had implied. It would be rough in the dark, rough in the cold, rough in the particular way of terrain that wasn't designed for human convenience. The horses were rested, and Mara had slept better than she'd had any right to, and there was something clarifying about riding before dawn, with a clear objective, and the specific knowledge that somewhere ahead of you a man was trying to undo everything that mattered. She pushed Remnant harder than she might have otherwise. They found a better pace on the downslope out of the pass, where the terrain opened up and the snow thinned. Cole set a hard pace, and she matched it. She noticed he checked behind them periodically, without making a performance of it casual, practiced the habit of someone who had learned to stay aware of what was behind him. Around mid-morning he checked behind them, and his posture changed. Not dramatically, not with alarm, but she'd been watching him all day, and she caught it a slight straightening. A second look held a beat longer than the first. "Someone's back there," she said, "one rider. About a mile back." He kept his eyes forward. "Could be nothing." "This is a traveled road, is it?" "Not much." She didn't look back. Looking back was useless, and invited a reaction that would signal they'd noticed. "How long have they been there?" "Since before the pass." She absorbed that. Before the pass meant the rider had been tracking them since Redbird, or had picked up their trail somewhere before it. Victor Voss was ahead of them. She hadn't forgotten Frank's account, which meant this rider behind them was someone else. Gideon's men. She thought of the two riders she'd heard on the road the night she'd fled. They would have returned to the ranch, reported her missing, and Gideon would have understood immediately what she'd done and where she'd gone. He would have sent riders east, not on the main road, because Voss was on the main road but on the secondary routes, hoping to intercept or cut off. "Can't stop us legally," she said, "if Gideon's men try to take the documents by force." "They won't do it on the open road," Cole said. Too visible. He kept his eyes moving, reading the terrain ahead. "But there's a stretch past the Halverson turnoff where the road drops into a gully. Less than ideal. Can we avoid it? I know a trail that cuts across the Halverson property. Adds about half a mile, but keeps us off the gully." He looked at her. "It's rough. I've noticed that's how you describe everything. Everything out here is rough. Then I already know what to expect. Take the trail." He turned off the road without breaking pace, swinging onto a line through the scrubs that she would not have identified as a trail if she hadn't been following him. She glanced back once she allowed herself that and saw nothing yet on the road behind them. The rider was far enough back. The Halverson trail was indeed rough. It was narrow and uneven and crossed at least 3 stretches of deep drift that required the horses to work hard. And somewhere in the second stretch, her knee screamed at her in a way she had been managing to ignore for most of the day, and could not fully ignore in the specific jarring of a horse laboring through deep snow. She set her jaw and kept moving. They came out of the Halverson property through a gap in the fence and rejoined the main road well past the gully. Cole looked back. "Nothing," he said. She breathed. "He either took the gully and missed us, or he figured out the turnoff and is well behind. Either way, we've got road ahead of us." He looked at the sky, reading something in it, the angle of the light, maybe. or the particular way the clouds were building to the north. Cheyenne's 4 hours. Hard push, we make it before the land office closes. 4 hours. She thought about Voss, somewhere ahead of them, trying to arrange an injunction or a delay, working his connections, being reasonable and methodical, and several steps ahead. She thought about her father's signature at the bottom of that will. Hard push, she said. They didn't stop again. The last 4 hours had a quality to them that she recognized from very few other experiences in her life, the specific compression of urgency, where time doesn't exactly speed up, but the present moment stops feeling like it extends in any direction, where there is only the ground ahead and the destination at the end of it, and the simple arithmetic of whether you will get there or you won't. She stopped feeling her knee around the second hour. She stopped feeling cold around the third. What she felt instead was something more like clarity, the particular narrowness of a problem reduced to its simplest terms. She had the documents. The land office was ahead. She needed to arrive before it closed, and before Voss could prevent the filing. Everything else, her uncle's calculation, Voss's connections, the writer who may or may not still be behind them, the months of fighting that almost certainly waited beyond this moment, all of it simplified, temporarily, to one point. Get there. Cole spotted the Cheyenne skyline before she did. He said nothing, just turned his head slightly, in a way that told her to look, and she looked, and there it was, the familiar rough geometry of a territorial capital in winter, low buildings and rising smoke, close enough that she could read it as real and not a destination. He pushed harder. She pushed harder. The land office on Cary Avenue had a particular appearance that she had spent the last 2 days constructing in her imagination. And the real version was smaller and plainer than the imagined one, but no less significant for that. They arrived in the late afternoon, with the light already going pale and thin, and she could see the lamp burning inside through the front window, which meant it was still open, which meant they had made it, and that knowledge was so abrupt after so many hours of not yet made it, that she had to spend a moment just letting it register. She dismounted before Cole could help her. Her knee buckled slightly on landing, and she caught herself on the saddle and straightened. Cole looped both sets of reins around the post without comment. She went inside. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man of perhaps 40, with the permanently distracted expression of someone who processes paperwork for a living and has long since stopped being interested in the content of it. He looked at Mara over his glasses. "We close in 20 minutes, he said. "It's enough time." She set the strongbox on the counter and opened it, and began laying documents out in the order she'd rehearsed in her head for the last 2 days. "I'm filing a contested land claim. I have an original will, an original deed, and a private ledger documenting 10 years of financial records for the Bellamy Ranch in." "Name?" the clerk said, producing a form. "Mara Bellamy." "Thomas Bellamy was my father. The property is registered under his name and should transfer to me per his will. There is a fraudulent transfer document that may have already been submitted, or that someone may attempt to submit in the next. Bellamy." The clerk's voice was patient, in the way of a man who handles a lot of distressed people. "One thing at a time," she breathed. "One thing at a time." She began with the will. She was 3 documents deep into the explanation when the door opened behind her. She knew before she turned. She knew from the quality of the silence that Cole had been standing in the way it changed, the slight shift of attention in the room. Victor Voss walked in from the Cheyenne afternoon, still in his polished coat, still with that expression of complete, patient reasonableness, and stopped when he saw her standing at the counter with her father's documents spread before her. For one moment, nothing moved. Then Voss straightened his coat and walked toward the counter. "Miss Bellamy?" he said. His voice was exactly what it had always been, warm, measured, entirely controlled. "I'm glad you've arrived safely. The weather has been terrible." She turned to face him fully and did not step back. "Mr. Voss." He looked at the documents on the counter. He looked at the clerk. He looked at Mara, and something shifted in his expression, very slightly, very briefly, that told her she had arrived before him, that he had not yet filed whatever he'd ridden ahead to file, and that the particular advantage he had counted on was not quite where he'd expected to find it. "I believe," he said, carefully, "that there may be some confusion about the status of the Bellamy estate." "There was confusion," Mara said. "I'm here to correct it." Turned back to the clerk. "Please timestamp everything," she said. "All of it now." The clerk looked between her and Voss. Voss opened his mouth. Cole, who had been standing inside the door without speaking, took one step forward. He didn't say anything. He didn't reach for anything. He simply moved one step, quiet, measured, and stood where he was standing, And something in the room shifted in the way rooms shift when they've recalculated the number of people worth taking seriously. Voss looked at Cole. Cole looked back. Voss closed his mouth. Clerk, making the kind of practical decision that men in small government offices make when they'd prefer to go home without incident, picked up his stamp. The sound of it coming down on her father's will, that small, definitive sound, was not dramatic. Completely mundane. A piece of metal hitting paper. An ink impression. A date and a time. But when Mara heard it, something in her chest shifted that had been locked in place for 5 weeks. Father's will, officially filed, officially time-stamped, on the record before any injunction, before any freeze, before any of Voss's careful arrangements could close around it. She held herself very still and let the clerk work through the remaining documents, and did not let herself feel anything beyond the immediate task until it was done. When it was done, she gathered the receipts the clerk produced copies, dated, signed, and put them in the strongbox with the care she would have given to something living. She snapped the latch shut. Then she turned and faced Victor Voss, who was still standing in the middle of the land office with his hands folded and his expression composed, because whatever else he was not a man who let his face do his thinking for him. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I want you to understand that what you've done today doesn't resolve the matter. There are legal avenues still available to your uncle." "Stand that," she said. "I expect we'll see each other in court." She walked past him. Cole fell into step beside her without having to be asked. Outside, the cold hit her again, and the light was going, and her knee had resumed making its opinion known in full, and she was 2 days from sleep, 2 days from food that wasn't bread eaten in a saddle, and still wearing her busted boots, and Cheyenne spread out in front of her without a plan or a person in it that she knew aside from the man standing beside her. She stood on the step of the land office and breathed out slowly. "It's filed," she said. "Yes," Cole said. She didn't say anything else for a moment. Cold was clean against her face. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped and a door closed, and the ordinary sounds of a territorial capital in the late afternoon went on without particular interest in what had just happened inside a small government office on Cary Avenue. "Thank you," she said finally, "for all of it." Cole looked at the street. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Voss is still in there, and your uncle hasn't answered for anything." She knew he was right. She knew this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a different, harder thing, the part that would move slower and hurt differently. Courts, the testimony, the specific grinding endurance of formal legal proceedings in a territory where wealthy men had friends and women claimants had to prove not only their facts, but their right to be believed. She knew all of that, but the will was filed. Her father's name was on the record. And whatever came next, it came next from a place that Gideon Bellamy had not chosen for her. Straightened her coat and looked at Cole. "What do you know about Cheyenne?" she said. "Not much," he said. "I know a place that serves a decent meal." "That," she said, "is exactly what I need to hear." They walked off the step together into the Cheyenne evening, and behind them in the land office, Victor Voss stood at the counter and looked at the clerk and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who is very rarely caught wrong-footed. The ground beneath this situation had shifted in a direction he had not fully prepared for. He needed to send a telegram to Gideon, and then he needed to start preparing for something considerably more complicated than a simple estate filing. The battle, as Mara already knew, had not ended here. It had simply moved inside. The meal Cole had promised turned out to be a boarding house on the western edge of Cheyenne, where the proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Aldrich, served supper at a long table, without asking whether you wanted it, which was exactly the right approach given that Mara had been living on cold bread and determination for 2 days. She ate more than she'd intended to, and said very little, and was aware, somewhere around the second helping, that her hands had finally stopped shaking. Cole ate across from her and didn't comment on the shaking or the stopping of it. They were given separate rooms, which Mrs. Aldrich established without being asked, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had run a boarding house long enough to head off uncomfortable situations before they developed. Mara's room was small and cold until the stove at the end of the hall warmed through the walls, and the bed was narrower than the one she'd grown up with, and she slept in it for 11 hours without moving. When she woke, she knew immediately where she was and why. There was none of the disorientation of the previous morning. The strongbox was on the floor beside her. The filing receipts were inside it. Those facts were solid. What was less solid was everything that came next. She dressed and went downstairs and found Cole already at the table with coffee and the particular expression of a man who had been awake for a while and had been thinking. He looked up when she came in. Voss spent the night at the Cheyenne Hotel, he said. I asked around this morning. She sat down and poured coffee. Of course he did. He met with someone last night. I don't know who. The hotel staff doesn't talk, but he was there for 2 hours. She thought about that. Voss working his connections. Voss already adjusting his approach. The filing had surprised him. She'd seen that in his face, that brief recalibration. But Victor Voss was not a man who stayed surprised. He would have spent last night converting his surprise into a new strategy, calling in favors, identifying the most useful pressure points, deciding which version of this story he intended to tell, and who in Cheyenne was positioned to help him tell it. I need to find Elias Rook, she said. Cole raised an eyebrow slightly. My father's attorney in Casper. He witnessed the will. If he's willing to come to Cheyenne and testify. She stopped. He's old. He doesn't travel well. And Casper in winter is not a short ride. You could write to him. Writing takes time we don't have. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Court sets a hearing date and Rook isn't here and available to confirm the will. Voss will use that gap to argue that the document's authenticity can't be established in session. She pressed her lips together. He's going to attack the will. That's what I would do if I were him. He can't make the ledger disappear, because the ledger is a private document and its absence of debt entries is a fact that stands on its own. But the will requires a witness, and if the witness can't be produced, then the forged transfer document stands as the only filed instrument, until Rook can be verified, which could take months. She set down the cup. I need to send a telegram to Casper today, and I need to find out who's been assigned to hear the case. Cole nodded. He didn't offer to handle it for her. She noticed that and was grateful for it. I need to stay in Cheyenne, she said. That's money I don't have a lot of. I'll cover the room. Cole, you can pay me back when you have the ranch. He said it without looking at her, refilling his coffee with the easy certainty of someone making a practical decision rather than a generous one. It's not charity, it's a loan. I charge interest. She looked at him. What interest? He thought about it with apparent seriousness. You teach me how to keep a proper ledger. Mine are a disaster. She almost laughed. She hadn't laughed in 5 weeks, and the nearness of it surprised her that her body still knew how to approach that particular response. Pressed it back down, not because it felt wrong, but because she wasn't ready for it yet. Fine, she said, deal. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was a 2-story brick building that smelled like wood polish and old paper and the specific anxiety of people waiting for other people to make decisions about their lives. Mara had been in courtrooms before she'd accompanied her father twice as a teenager, once for a boundary dispute with a neighboring property and once for a contract disagreement with a supplier, but she had never been the claimant, had never been the person whose name the whole proceeding was organized around. The difference was larger than she'd anticipated. She filed the additional paperwork required to formally contest the fraudulent transfer, attached copies of the filing receipts from the land office, and was told that a hearing date would be set within 2 weeks. 2 weeks felt both very long and very short. She sent the telegram to Elias Rook in Casper, concise, factual, urgent, and waited. She didn't wait quietly. The 2 weeks before the hearing became the most bureaucratically complicated period of her life, and she had helped run a ranch for a decade, which had not been uncomplicated. She spent her mornings at the courthouse or the land office, working through every procedural requirement with the methodical stubbornness that had kept her father's books accurate through 3 years of difficult finances. She spent her afternoons reading every document in the strongbox for the 100th time, looking for angles, vulnerabilities, anything Voss might use. Cole was not idle either, though he went about his business in ways that she didn't always see directly. She knew he was making inquiries. She could see it in the small pieces of information he brought back in the evenings, delivered without drama over supper at Mrs. Aldrich's table. A name here, a connection there. The kind of information that comes from talking to the right people in the right casual way. Rook's telegram arrived on the 5th day. She opened it at the small desk in her room and read it twice. Elias Rook, 71 years old, confirmed receipt of her telegram, confirmed his willingness to testify, and confirmed that he was in possession of his own copy of Thomas Bellamy's will, filed in his office in Casper, with the original signature page and witness attestations intact. He was also, the telegram noted, not in good health, and the journey to Cheyenne in winter was not something he could undertake alone. She read that line 3 times. Then she went downstairs. Cole was at the table. He had been writing something she'd noticed him. Writing occasionally, letters it seemed, though she hadn't asked to whom, and he set the pen down when she came in. She handed him the telegram without preamble. He read it. He set it on the table. "I'll go," he said. She had been prepared to argue the point. She had assembled several reasonable arguments about the impracticality of him making that ride, about the time it would take, about the risk. All of them dissolved in the face of him simply saying it before she could build up to asking. "That's 4 days minimum," she said. "Round trip in these conditions. 5 maybe. If Rook needs an easy pace, the hearing could be set by the time you get back." "I know." He folded the telegram and handed it back to her. "You'll manage the hearing better than I would anyway. You understand the documents. I'd just be sitting there." She looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the angle of it, the calculation, the reservation, the part where this cost him something he was choosing not to show. She didn't find it. He just looked back at her with that same level, unhurried patience. "Why are you doing this?" she said, not aggressively, not even suspiciously, just genuinely. She had been carrying the question since that first morning at his kitchen table and had not found a satisfying answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. Then, before she could respond to that, he added, "And because if someone had done it for my wife, things might have gone different." He said it simply, without visible pain, the way you state a fact that you've made your peace with, even if you haven't fully made your peace with it. She needed help once and didn't get it in time. That's not a reason to tell you. Just why I don't walk away from these things anymore. The room was quiet. Mara didn't say she was sorry, because he didn't seem to want that. She didn't say anything consoling, because he wasn't asking for consolation. She just held the information and treated it with the respect it deserved, which was to take it seriously and not fill the space it occupied with unnecessary sound. "Be careful on the pass," she said. "Always am." He left the next morning before she was up. The hearing was set for 11 days out, which meant Cole had enough time to reach Casper and return with Rook if the weather held, and nothing went badly wrong. Mara kept that arithmetic in the back of her head constantly, running it against every weather change, every report of road conditions that filtered through the boarding house. She also had other problems. Gideon arrived in Cheyenne on the 8th day. She saw him from the window of the courthouse, stepping down from a hired carriage with Victor Voss beside him, both of them in heavy winter coats. Gideon with his silver hair and his straight bearing and the easy confidence of a man who had never seriously had to consider the possibility that a room wasn't going to go his way. He looked prosperous and calm. He looked like a respected landowner who had traveled to address a minor misunderstanding. He looked nothing like what he was. She watched him and felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the December air, the specific chill of understanding that the man who had carried her father's casket was about to walk into a courtroom and argue, with his full persuasive authority, that Thomas Bellamy had wanted his brother to have everything and his daughter to have an allowance. She turned away from the window and went back to her table. There was a man she needed to talk to. His name was Harlan Briggs, and she knew about him from a conversation Cole had reported before leaving for Casper. Cole had been quiet about how he'd found out. It said only that he'd spoken to a few people who knew the Bellamy Ranch, looking for anyone who might have noticed something. But what he'd found was this: Harlan Briggs, a longtime hand on the Bellamy property, had been keeping his own set of notes for the past year. Not formal records, not anything he'd planned to use. Just a working man's habit of writing down what didn't add up, the specific numbers that didn't match what he was being told, the payroll discrepancies he'd noticed and been waved away from when he'd asked about them. Harlan Briggs was not in Cheyenne. He was still on the ranch. She sent him a letter, not through the regular mail, which Gideon's men might intercept if they were paying attention. She found a freighter heading north who agreed for $2 to deliver a sealed envelope directly and personally to a man named Briggs on the Bellamy property. She wrote the letter carefully, not asking him to lie, not asking him to do anything beyond what he already knew to be true. Told him what she'd filed. She told him what was happening. She told him that if he had information about financial irregularities and was willing to share it with the territorial investigator, it might not only help her case, but also correct a wrong that had been building for over a year. She sealed the envelope and paid the freighter and didn't know if it would arrive in time or at all. Then she went back to preparing for the hearing, because the hearing was what she could directly control, and the rest of it she would have to trust. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined. Not a grand hall, a plain, practical room with wood benches and tall windows that let in the white winter light, and a judge's bench that was elevated just enough to make its authority clear without being theatrical about it. Mara arrived early and sat at the claimant's table and arranged her documents and tried not to look at Gideon, who sat across the room with Victor Voss and a second attorney she didn't recognize and two witnesses she also didn't recognize, whose function she would have to determine as the proceeding went on. The judge was a man named Harrington, not young, not old, with the deliberate bearing of someone who had heard enough territory disputes to have strong opinions about the waste of his time. He looked at both tables when he entered with an expression that suggested he had already assessed the room and reserved judgment. Cole had arrived back from Casper the previous evening, 2 days before the hearing. Elias Rook had come with him. Rook was smaller than Mara had expected. She had only met him twice as a child and clearly older than the man she remembered, white-haired and careful in his movements, with the slight deliberateness of someone for whom physical effort required more planning than it once had. But his mind was exactly what she needed it to be, precise, well-documented, and absolute certain about what he had witnessed. He sat in the back row of the courtroom now, with Cole beside him, and when Mara glanced back, Cole caught her eye and gave a single nod that communicated, "He's steady. It's fine." She turned back to the front. Victor Voss rose first, which she had expected, because Voss was always going to try to set the frame before she could. He was composed and fluent, laying out Gideon's position with the careful architecture of a man who had thought through every word the transfer document, duly notarized, executed 18 months before Thomas Bellamy's death, at a time when Thomas had been concerned about the ranch's financial stability, the debts owed to Gideon, money lent privately between brothers over several years, the legitimate desire of a dying man to ensure that his family's property didn't fall into legal chaos after his death. He made it sound almost reasonable. That was the skill of it. Voss never made things sound like lies. He made them sound like the sensible interpretation of complicated facts. When Mara stood, she felt the room's attention shift, not hostility, not exactly, but the specific weight of a room full of men watching a woman do something they weren't accustomed to watching women do. She was aware of it the way she was aware of bad weather, something to account for, not something to stop her. She began with the ledger. She walked through 10 years of her father's financial records, entry by entry on the key points, not exhaustively, not tediously, but specifically and clearly, the way her father had taught her to follow a line of numbers to its conclusion. The ledger showed no debt to Gideon Bellamy, not in any year, not in any amount. The ranch's liabilities were documented carefully. A bank loan retired in 1,882, a supplier credit resolved in 1,884, a feed debt from a hard winter in 1,880 that Thomas had paid off in full by spring. Every obligation, every settlement, recorded in her father's own hand. There was no record of any money from Gideon, not a loan, not a gift, not a transfer of any kind. The debts cited in the transfer document, she said, do not appear anywhere in 12 years of my father's private ledger. Not in any form. If my father owed his brother money substantial enough to justify transferring an entire ranch, he would have recorded it. My father recorded everything. That was the kind of man he was. Voss objected that a private ledger was not a legal instrument. Mara agreed calmly that it wasn't, but said that its consistent internal accuracy over 12 years, tracking every verifiable financial event of the ranch's operation, made its silence about Gideon's claimed loan significant. Harrington looked at the ledger. He had the expression of a man who knew what consistent bookkeeping looked like and what sloppy bookkeeping looked like, and was making a determination about which of these was. He asked to have the ledger entered into evidence. Voss's jaw tightened just barely at the corner. Then Mara called Elias Rook. Rook walked to the front of the room slowly, but without assistance, which she suspected cost him something. He sat in the witness position and looked at the court with the calm of a man who had been telling the truth his entire professional life and saw no reason to approach this occasion differently. He confirmed that he had drafted the will of Thomas Henry Bellamy in the fall of 1884. He confirmed that he had been present at its signing. He confirmed that he had witnessed it along with his sus office assistant, Margaret Holt. He confirmed that his copy of the signed document was in his possession and had been continuously in his possession since the date of signing. Voss cross-examined him carefully, probing for uncertainty in the dates, for any possibility that the document might have been altered or substituted, for any weakness in the chain of custody. Rook answered each question with the specific, unhurried precision of a man who kept excellent records and knew exactly what was in them. At one point, Voss suggested delicately that Rook's memory might not be entirely reliable given his age. Rook looked at Voss with an expression of the mildest conceivable contempt. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I have drafted 412 wills in 40 years of practice. I remember each client I sat with. I remembered Thomas Bellamy, because he was a careful man who read every line out of his own will before signing it, asked 3 clarifying questions about the inheritance provisions, and told me afterward that he hoped his daughter never needed to use it, but that she'd know what to do if she did. Rook folded his hands. I remember him clearly. The courtroom was very quiet. Gideon, across the room, had been watching the proceedings with an expression of steady confidence that Mara had been monitoring from the edge of her attention. She had watched it through Rook's testimony. She watched it now. It had not changed. That bothered her. A man who was losing should show it somewhere in the set of his shoulders, in the frequency with which he consulted with Voss, in some small crack of adjustment. Gideon showed none of it. He sat with the ease of someone who had a remaining card to play, and was comfortable with its weight in his hand. She didn't know what it was. Harrington recessed for the afternoon. She found Cole in the corridor outside, standing near the wall in the way he stood when he was thinking still, arms crossed, slightly apart from the general movement of people. Rook had been taken to a chair in the anteroom by a courthouse clerk who had apparently decided the old man needed looking after, which Rook was tolerating with resigned dignity. He has something, she said to Cole, low, not wanting to be overheard. Gideon, he's not worried enough. Cole nodded. He'd been watching too. Voss's second attorney, the one you didn't recognize. I found out who he is. She waited. His name is Pemberton. He specializes in estate challenges. He's filed on behalf of several Cheyenne families, always for the side with money. Cole's voice was even. He's good at finding procedural angles, ways to delay, to complicate, ways to make a case that should be simple into something that takes 2 years and runs out the other side's money before it runs out his clients. She absorbed that, a delay strategy. Gideon didn't need to win today. He needed to drag this out long enough that she ran out of resources, ran out of endurance, ran out of options. He had the ranch's income to sustain him. She had $43 and a loan from a rancher she'd met 4 days ago. What do I do, she said. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you need something that can't be delayed. Not a documents can be challenged. Not a witnesses can be questioned, he thought. Something that makes the fraud undeniable without requiring anyone to take your word for it. Thought about Harlan Briggs, about the letter she'd sent, about whether it had reached him, whether he'd read it, whether he'd decided it was worth the risk. She had no way to know. The afternoon session resumed. Pemberton opened by filing a motion to delay the proceedings pending an independent verification of the Rook will's chain of custody, specifically requesting that Margaret Holt, Rook's former office assistant, be located and deposed before any ruling on the document's authenticity. It was elegant. Margaret Holt had left Rook's employ in 1885 and moved to Denver. Locating her and bringing her to Cheyenne would take months, and during those months, the estate transfer would remain effectively in Gideon's hands. Harrington looked at the motion. He looked at Mara. She stood, Your Honor. The request to locate a secondary witness is a delay mechanism. The primary witness is present, under oath, and has provided specific, detailed, consistent testimony about a document he personally drafted and personally witnessed. The chain of custody of his own copy is unbroken. She kept her voice steady. What I would ask the court to consider is this. We have an original will, filed by a licensed attorney, witnessed by that attorney under oath, against a transfer document with a disputed signature and no corresponding financial record in 12 years of the transferring party's private books. Delaying this proceeding does not resolve that disparity. Only extends the period during which the estate is improperly administered. Harrington looked at the motion. He looked at Voss. He looked at Pemberton. He denied the delay motion. Pemberton's expression didn't change, but Voss's did marginally, a slight pressure around the eyes. They hadn't expected that. They'd expected the delay to be granted as routine. It wasn't routine, because Harrington was not a judge who confused routine with correct. The session continued through the afternoon, grinding through procedural points on both sides, and by the time Harrington recessed again it was late, and the winter light through the tall windows had gone gray and flat. Nothing was resolved. The hearing would continue the next morning. Mara went back to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house and sat at the desk in her room and did not sleep. She was going through the ledger again, not looking for something new, just following the numbers the way she would follow a familiar road, for the comfort of the known path when she heard the knock. Cole. He opened the door slightly and said, There's someone here. She followed him downstairs. In the front room of the boarding house, sitting on the edge of Mrs. Aldrich's best parlor chair with his hat in his hands and his boots still carrying trail mud, was a lean, weathered man in his mid-50s with the look of someone who had ridden a long distance quickly and wasn't entirely sure the decision to do so had been correct yet. "Harlan Briggs, he stood when he saw her, Miss Bellamy," he said. He had a rough voice, the kind that came from years of outdoor work, and he was looking at her with a complicated expression, not quite apology, not quite defiance, something in between, that told her he'd been sitting on whatever he was about to say for a while, and it hadn't gotten easier with time. "Got your letter. Took me 3 days to get here. Wasn't sure I should come." He turned his hat in his hands. "But I've been sitting on this for 8 months and I can't." He stopped. Started again. "Your father was a good man, the best employer I ever had. And what's been done to his property, to his name, I can't sit quiet about it anymore." She sat down across from him and said, "Tell me." He told her. What Harlan Briggs had noticed over the previous year was not dramatic in individual pieces, it was the accumulation that was damning. Payroll entries that didn't match the actual payments he'd received and seen other hands receive. Feed invoices for quantities of stock that didn't correspond to the number of animals on the property. Fencings and repair expenditures claimed in amounts that bore no relationship to the work that had actually been done. Small, consistent, systematic, the kind of manipulation that required someone who understood ranch finances well enough to skim from the edges without visibly gutting the center. He'd been recording it. He had a notebook, not a formal ledger, just a working man's record of what didn't add up dating back to the spring. "Why didn't you say something?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "About the payroll numbers. Gideon's foreman told me the numbers were correct, and if I thought otherwise, I could look for work elsewhere." He paused. "I got 3 kids, Miss Bellamy. I didn't push." She understood. She didn't fault him for it. "Will you testify?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see the calculation happening, the risk assessment of a man who knew exactly what he stood to lose if this went wrong, which was his livelihood and possibly more. "Gideon's men will know I've been here," he said. "I know. Court doesn't rule in your favor. I know that too." He looked at his hat. Then he looked at her. "Your father helped me when I had nothing," he said. "Gave me work when nobody else would, and didn't hold my past against me." He stopped turning the hat. "Yes, I'll testify." She thought she would feel something large at that. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude in some overwhelming form. What she actually felt was smaller and more specific, a steadying. The way the ground feels solid under your feet when you've been walking uncertain terrain long enough to start doubting it. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it more completely than she could make the 2 words carry. Cole sat in the corner of the parlor and said nothing, and looked at nothing in particular, and Mara was aware, in some peripheral way, that he had probably arranged Harlan Briggs's safe arrival in Cheyenne, without quite saying so, had probably made sure the letter found its way to the right hands, and that a rider who left the Bellamy Ranch, abruptly, would have somewhere to go. She didn't ask. She filed the knowledge the way she filed everything she didn't have words for yet. The next morning, Harlan Briggs took the witness chair. He was not a polished witness. He spoke like a working man speaks plainly, without flourish, sometimes circling back when he lost a thought, occasionally stopping to make sure he'd gotten a number right before he committed to it. Victor Voss tried to rattle him twice, suggesting that his record-keeping was informal, suggesting that his interpretation of the numbers was unsophisticated, suggesting that payroll discrepancies could have innocent administrative explanations. Harlan looked at him and said, "I've been paid wages my whole working life. I know what was owed to me, and I know what I got. The numbers in my book are what I was owed. The numbers in Gideon's ledger are different. That's not interpretation. That's arithmetic." The courtroom made a small sound that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite approval, but was something in between. Harrington asked to see the notebook. Voss objected that it was not a formal business record. Harrington pointed out that the court had already admitted a private ledger and found no compelling reason to treat a ranch hand's private record differently, given that both were contemporaneous, first-person accounts of financial transactions. He admitted the notebook. Mara watched Gideon. There it was, the first visible crack. A brief, controlled movement of his jaw, quickly stilled. The look he gave Voss, rapid, small, gone before most of the room registered it. But Mara had been watching him for years across holiday dinners and property line conversations, and she knew the architecture of his composure well enough to see where it strained. He had not anticipated Harlan Briggs. The session recessed at noon. When it resumed, Harrington announced that given the scope of the financial discrepancies, being raised discrepancies that appeared to extend beyond the specific transfer document under contestation, he was formally referring the matter to the territorial. Investigator's Office for a full audit of the Bellamy estate's financial records going back 3 years. He placed the estate under court protection pending that audit. No transfers, no sales, no expenditures beyond basic operations without court approval. Gideon was not removed from the property. Not yet. The investigation was opened, and once it was opened, whatever was in those records would be found. Because territorial investigators were not interested in the political convenience of wealthy ranchers. They were interested in the numbers, and numbers Mara knew did not care who they embarrassed. Gideon stood when Harrington finished speaking, and the movement caught everyone's attention because he was so controlled in everything he did that simple standing felt like a statement. He looked at Mara across the courtroom, not at Voss, not at Harrington, at her, and his expression was composed and careful and entirely itself. Then he looked away. It was not the look of a man who had surrendered. She knew that. She had spent enough time understanding how this man thought to know that a setback to Gideon Bellamy was not a conclusion, it was a problem to be managed. He would not fold. He would not confess. He would look for the next angle, the next arrangement, the next version of the story that kept him on the right side of the line. But the investigation was open. The documents were in the record. Her father's will was filed, time-stamped, witnessed by the man who had drafted it. And Harlan Briggs's notebook, that rough, ordinary, entirely unglamorous document, a working man's record of what didn't add up, was in evidence. She walked out of the courtroom and stood on the courthouse steps in the December, cold, and breathed. Cole appeared beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood and looked at the gray Cheyenne street with his hands in his coat pockets and his small clouds in the air. "It's not over," she said. "No, he's going to come back with something. Some other approach. Voss will find a way to complicate the investigations. Probably. And the audit will take months, and during those months, Mara," voice was quiet, not cutting her off, just putting a hand on the momentum of her thinking. Stopped. He looked at her. "You know all that. You don't need to say it to me." She did know all that. What she also knew, standing on those courthouse steps, was that 5 weeks ago she had been in a parlor being told to sign a lie, and she had refused. And she had walked 8 miles through a blizzard, with nothing but the truth and the stubbornness to carry it. And the truth was now in the record, and the investigation was open, and her father's will was real and filed and witnessed and alive in the record of this territory. That was not everything, but it was not nothing. "The estate's protected," she said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. She looked at the street, at the ordinary traffic of a territorial capital going about its day without particular interest in what had just happened inside a courtroom. Somewhere in this city, Gideon was sitting with Victor Voss and working through the next move. Somewhere in Casper, Elias Rook was making the return journey, slow and careful, back to the office where he had kept her father's future safe for 2 years, without knowing it would be needed. Harlan Briggs was still inside, she thought. She'd need to make sure he had somewhere safe to stay. There was always the next thing. She was starting to understand that the fight for her father's name was not a single confrontation, it was a sustained one, built from small decisions accumulated over time, the way her father had built the ranch itself. One season, one decision, one carefully kept record at a time. She had his ledger in her arms, and his will in the record, and the truth in the courtroom. She was not finished. But for the first time since she'd stood in that parlor and looked at a forged signature, she felt the ground beneath the fight firm real, holding weight. She went back inside to find Harlan Briggs. The audit took 47 days. Mara knew the number because she had counted them, not out of impatience exactly, but because counting was something concrete to do when everything else was moving at a pace determined by other people's schedules. She had grown up measuring time in practical units, seasons, feed cycles, calving windows, the specific arithmetic of when money needed to come in against when it needed to go out. 47 days of waiting did not come naturally to her, and she managed it the way she managed most things that didn't come naturally, by finding the smallest useful thing she could do and doing it relentlessly. She stayed in Cheyenne. Cole stayed too, which she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't expected. He had a ranch to run, she knew that, had said so twice, had told him there was no reason for him to sit in a boarding house in a territorial capital waiting for investigators to finish work he couldn't help with. He had looked at her both times with the specific expression of a man who has heard an argument and found it unpersuasive, and had gone back to whatever he'd been doing and had not left. Stopped asking him to. Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house became in those 47 days the closest thing to a base of operations that Mara had. She set up a system at the small desk in her room, documents on the left, correspondence on the right, a separate stack in the middle for anything that required a response within 48 hours. The investigator sent periodic notices, formal and careful, telling her nothing specific but confirming the audit was ongoing. Harrington's court protection order remained in place. Gideon was still on the ranch property, which grated at her, in ways she tried not to let consume too much energy, but there it was. Victor Voss filed 2 motions during the audit period. The first attempted to narrow the scope of the investigation to the specific transfer document only, excluding the broader financial records. Harrington denied it. The second attempted to challenge Harlan Briggs's testimony, on the grounds that his employment relationship with Gideon created a financial motivation to misrepresent. Harrington denied that too, noting that the same argument could be applied to any witness in any proceeding, and was therefore not specific grounds for exclusion. Mara read both denials with the same feeling she'd had on the courthouse steps, not triumph, because neither denial resolved anything, but the solid, grounding sense of the floor holding. Harlan Briggs had gone back north. She'd arranged a position for him with a rancher, 2 properties over from the Bellamy land, a man named Sutherland who had known her father and who had agreed, without much pressing, to take on an experienced hand for the winter. Harlan had left Cheyenne with less certainty in his expression than she would have liked, but with his head up, and she had watched him ride out and made a private accounting of what she owed him, which was more than she could currently pay, and which she intended to settle when she could. Elias Rook had returned to Casper. He wrote twice short letters, careful in their phrasing, confirming that he remained available if the court required additional testimony and that his health, while not excellent, was holding. She wrote back both times. She also sent a letter to Margaret Holt in Denver, whom Voss had tried to weaponize as an absent witness and who turned out, when contacted directly, to be entirely willing to provide a written attestation of what she had witnessed in Rook's office in 1884. Voss had apparently not considered that she might be reachable. That oversight told Mara something about how Voss thought about women as obstacles when they were present and non-factors when they were absent, which was a habit of mind she intended to use against him. Holt's written attestation arrived by post on the 29th day. Mara filed it with the court the same afternoon. Cole spent his time in Cheyenne in ways that she only partially understood. He made inquiries she'd established that about him. By now, his particular method of gathering information through conversations that looked like nothing from the outside. He knew people in the territory the way a man who has spent 20 years riding its roads knows people, not by wealth or rank, but by the accumulation of small, honest dealings. He came back in the evenings and reported what was relevant and didn't report what wasn't, and she had stopped trying to account for the full extent of what he was doing and simply took what he told her and added it to what she knew. On the 32nd day, he came back from wherever he'd been and sat down across from her at the supper table and said, "The investigators found a second set of ledgers." She put down her fork, kept separately from the ranch records, stored at Gideon's attorney's office in Casper. Not Rook's office, a different one. "They've been subpoenaed." He ate a bite and then said, "The numbers in the second set don't match the numbers in the ranch records. By a significant amount." "How significant?" "The investigator I spoke to wouldn't give me specifics, but he said significant." She sat with that for a moment. A second set of ledger's hidden records maintained parallel to the legitimate books. This was not the territory of a man who had made a single opportunistic mistake in a moment of financial pressure. This was systematic. This was planned. This was someone who had been running a parallel operation for long enough to know a separate accounting system to track it. "He's been doing this for years," she said. "Looks like it." She thought about her father, about the last 2 years of his life, when he'd been sick and increasingly unable to oversee the ranch's operations with his former closeness. About the times he'd mentioned that Gideon had been helping, that Gideon had taken on some of the administrative burden, said it with the particular gratitude of a man who trusted his brother and was relieved to have the help. About how Mara had been busy with the physical work of the ranch and had not thought to look as closely as she might have at what Gideon was doing with the books. Felt the particular, grinding guilt of that, the if-only quality of it, and then she set it down because it was not useful, and her father would not have wanted her to carry it. "What else?" she said. "Nothing definite." But the investigator seemed like a man who was going to be very thorough. Cole looked at her. "I think the audit is going to find more than what Harlan noticed." "How much more?" "I don't know. But Gideon has been running that ranch's finances with full authority for 2 years. If there's a second ledger, there are probably more things hidden in it than just payroll discrepancies." She nodded slowly. She thought about the settlement offer. she'd turned down 6 weeks ago, before the hearing. Voss had sent it through an intermediary, not a formal legal document, just a carefully worded letter suggesting that Mara might consider a negotiated resolution in which she would receive the ranch property outright, along with a cash settlement for the contested period, in exchange for agreeing not to pursue criminal charges against Gideon. She had read the letter twice and then put it in the middle stack, which was where she put things that required a response, and had thought about it for 3 days. Then she had written back, through her own intermediary, a Cheyenne attorney named Parks she'd hired with the last of her savings, and said no. Parks had looked at her when she told him that decision. Miss Bellamy, he had said, with the careful phrasing of a man who understood his job, was to represent her interests as she defined them, rather than as he would define them. The offer on the table is comprehensive. You would recover the ranch in full. The cash settlement would address the period of fraudulent operation, and you would avoid what could be a lengthy criminal proceeding. I know what the offer addresses, she had said. I also know why it's being made. Gideon isn't offering me the ranch because he's decided to be fair. He's offering me the ranch because the audit is going to find things that he cannot explain, and a criminal proceeding would expose not just the ranch records, but everything else he's touched. She had looked at Parks steadily. He wants to buy my silence before the audit finishes. This is. Parks had been quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable reading of it. It's the only reading of it. She had picked up the letter and then set it down again. My father spent 30 years building something honest. Gideon spent 2 years stealing from it while my father was dying. If I take that settlement, Gideon walks away from all of it. He doesn't answer for any of it. He just moves on to the next thing. She paused. I'm not trading justice for convenience, no. She had declined, and Parks had sent the letter, and she had not heard from Voss directly since. Now, sitting at Mrs. Aldrich's table with the news of the second ledger settling into her understanding, she was aware of a cold, clear feeling, not satisfaction, because nothing was finished, but something adjacent to vindication. The kind that comes not from being proven right, but from the knowledge that you made the correct decision before you had all the evidence. And the evidence is coming in anyway. He's going to make another offer, she said to Cole. Probably. I'm going to refuse it. Cole looked at her. I know, he said simply. She reached for her fork and resumed eating, and thought that was one of the things about Cole Mercer that she had come to depend on without meaning to. He did not require her to explain herself when the explanation was already visible in everything she'd done. The second offer came 12 days later, on the 44th day of the audit. It was more generous than the first, considerably more. Cash settlement number had increased substantially, and this time the letter also offered a formal written apology, from Gideon, a private document, not public, acknowledging that there had been irregularities in the management of the estate. Irregularities, as if he'd misplaced a feed invoice. She read it and set it in the middle stack and sat with it, for 1 day this time, not 3. Then she went to find Parks. No, she said. Parks looked at the letter. He looked at her. He did not argue. He had, by this point, developed a fairly accurate model of who Mara Bellamy was and what she was and was not going to do, and he had adjusted his counsel accordingly. I want you to send a response, she said, polite, formal, saying that I appreciate the offer, and I am not interested in a negotiated settlement that does not include full accountability for all financial misconduct identified in the audit, including any criminal referrals the investigators determine are appropriate. She paused. And that I expect the audit to conclude shortly, after which my position on any settlement will be informed by its findings. Parks wrote it down. You understand that after the audit concludes, if the investigators refer criminal charges, the settlement possibility may close entirely. I understand. Gideon's attorneys will argue you're being unreasonable. They're welcome to argue whatever they like. She stood. He stole from my father while my father was dying. He forged his name. He tried to take everything my father built. That's going to be answered for. It needs to be answered for fully, not partially, in a private document, with a number that makes it go away quietly. She looked at Parks with the particular steadiness that had been building in her since the night she'd walked out of her father's house into a blizzard. Send the letter. The audit concluded on the 47th day. The findings were delivered to Harrington's court in a document 23 pages long, which Mara read in its entirety at the courthouse, standing at the clerk's counter because she couldn't wait to sit down somewhere. The numbers were worse than she had prepared herself for. Over the preceding 2.5 years, Gideon Bellamy had redirected the investigators' careful word for it, which covered a range of mechanisms more specific than the word implied over $60,000 from the Bellamy Ranch's operating accounts, through a combination of manipulated payroll figures, false vendor invoices, undisclosed property transfers, and the diversion of cattle sale, proceeds through an intermediary account in his own name in a Casper bank. 3 smaller adjacent properties had been transferred quietly through paperwork that had been filed in ways designed to obscure the connection to the Bellamy estate into a holding arrangement that benefited Gideon directly. Forged transfer document that had started all of this, the document Mara had looked at in the parlor and refused to sign, was almost a secondary detail in the full scope of what the audit had found. It was the most visible piece, the one that had cracked the surface, but beneath it was a structure that had been built carefully and deliberately over years. $60,000. She read that number 3 times. Her father had been alive for the first 6 months of it. Sick, slowing down, trusting his brother to help manage the burden. He had not known. She was certain of that. Thomas Bellamy's own private ledger showed none of it, showed a man tracking his legitimate accounts with the same careful hand he'd always used, entirely unaware that a parallel set of books was being maintained by the person he trusted most. She folded the audit document and put it in the strongbox and walked out of the courthouse. Cole was outside. He'd been waiting, standing by the horses in the cold. He looked at her face when she came down the steps and asked nothing. $60,000, she said. He was quiet for a moment. And 3 properties, she added. He let out a slow breath. Is it enough? He said. For criminal referral? Yes. Parks had told her the threshold, and what the audit described was well beyond it. The investigators are recommending the territorial prosecutor review the findings for charges. She looked at the street. Going to take time, more time. A criminal proceeding is different from the civil case. It's the territory against Gideon, not me against Gideon. I don't control it, but it moves forward. It moves forward. Cole nodded. She looked at him standing there by the horses in the gray December air and thought about the fact that he had been here for 47 days. His ranch was running on minimal oversight, managed by the single reliable hand he employed, a man named Cobb who Cole clearly trusted, but who was also one man doing the work of 3. She knew this because Cole had mentioned it once, briefly, as a logistical fact rather than a complaint, and had not mentioned it again. You should go home, she said. I'll go when there's something to go back to, he said. She frowned. What does that mean? He looked at the horses for a moment, and she had the impression he was organizing something, not stalling, not avoiding, just finding the right arrangement of words. It means I don't have a particular urgency to get back to an empty house. He said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact. Cobb can manage the basics through the winter. The cattle are in. He glanced at her. You still have things to settle here. She did still have things to settle here. That was true, but she was also aware, standing in the cold outside the Cheyenne courthouse, that the things she still had to settle felt different now than they had 47 days ago. They were still large, but the shape of them had changed. The audit's findings, referred to the prosecutor, meant that whatever happened next was moving on a trajectory that didn't require her constant vigilance in quite the same way. The record was built. The evidence was in official hands. The machinery of territorial justice, however slow, was now engaged. She was not finished, but she was also not the only one carrying this anymore. The ranch was placed under expanded court protection following the audit's referral to the prosecutor. Gideon received formal notice that he was under investigation for criminal fraud and was required to remain within the territory pending further proceedings. His accounts were frozen. Voss filed an immediate challenge, which Harrington addressed in a session that lasted 3 hours, and concluded with the protection order being upheld and expanded. Gideon, Mara was told through Parks, had not spoken publicly about any of it. He had not given interviews, had not made statements, had not appeared in any of the social settings in Cheyenne where a man of his standing would normally be visible. He was, as far as anyone could tell, working through his attorneys and otherwise staying out of sight. She thought about him sitting in her father's leather chair with a glass of whiskey and a forged document and that patient smile. She thought about what it was costing him, now, to sit still and wait. She hoped it cost him considerably. On the 52nd day since the hearing, Parks sent word that the territorial prosecutor had accepted the referral and was opening a formal criminal investigation. The civil case, the restoration of the estate to Mara's ownership, would proceed on its own track, with a resolution hearing scheduled for 6 weeks out. 6 more weeks. She sat with that number for an evening and then accepted it. That night she and Cole ate supper later than usual because she'd lost track of time reading correspondence, and Mrs. Aldrich had left a covered plate without comment because she had, over the past 7 weeks, developed a quiet appreciation for what was happening in her boarding house. She set it on the table and Cole uncovered it, and they ate without much conversation. Comfortable silence of two people who have spent enough time in close proximity that they have sorted through most of the words they needed and arrived somewhere quieter. "I've been thinking about the Halverson Trail," Coles said, eventually. "Up. What about it?" "There's a stretch of it that's better terrain than the main road, but it only works in certain seasons. Thought about clearing a proper line through there, making it a permanent route." He moved food around his plate in the way he did when he was thinking out loud. "It would cut the ride between my property and the Bellamy land by about 2 hours." She considered that. The Bellamy land was roughly 12 miles from Cole's Ridge Ranch, not an impossible distance, but not a casual one either. 2-hour reduction would make it manageable as a regular route. Kind of distance you could cover between morning and midday if you had a reason to. "Why would you need to get between your property and my father's ranch more quickly?" she said. He looked at her. The look was direct and uncomplicated. "Can't think of reasons right now," he said. "Just seems like useful infrastructure." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in that something she recognized, without being ready to fully name. Something that had been developing for the past 7 weeks, through the accumulation of small, reliable presences, through the ice crossing and the telegram and the ride to Casper and the 47 days of staying. She looked back at her plate. "It would probably be useful," she said. "That's what I thought." They finished eating. She lay awake that night for a while. Not with anxiety. The anxiety had changed its quality since the audit, become less acute and more chronic, the sustained low noise of a long fight rather than the sharp immediate crisis of those first days. She lay awake with something that she would not have expected to feel in the middle of this much difficulty, something approaching the careful, tentative awareness of a future. Not a resolved future, not a clear one, but the sense that beyond the legal proceedings and the prosecutor's investigation and the 6-week wait for the resolution hearing, there was ground to stand on. There were decisions to make that were not purely defensive. There were questions she hadn't let herself ask, because asking them had felt presumptuous when survival was the primary concern. Where did she want to be? What did she want to build? Who did she want standing beside her while she built it? She was not ready to answer all of those questions. But she noticed, lying in the dark of Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, that she was asking them. That was new. The 6 weeks moved differently than the 47 days had. She spent them preparing for the resolution hearing, working with Parks on the presentation of the civil case, reviewing the audit findings against the original documents, making sure everything was in order and organized in a way that the court could move through efficiently. She also spent some of it doing things she hadn't had time for before, writing letters to the ranch hands she'd known growing up, finding out who was still employed there and in what condition, trying to build a picture of what she would find when she was finally able to go back. Harlan Briggs wrote once from Sutherland's place, a short letter that said the work was decent, the pay was honest, and that he appreciated what she'd done to make it happen. He asked if she'd be needing extra hands when the ranch came back to her. She wrote back and said yes. Cole made 2 trips back to his Ridge Ranch during those 6 weeks, one of 3 days, one of 5, and returned each time without making a point of having left and without making a point of having come back. He brought Cobb a message once, she suspected, and came back with information about road conditions and weather patterns that turned out to be practically useful for the resolution hearing's scheduling. She didn't ask. She'd stopped asking. The resolution hearing was not dramatic in the way the initial hearing had been. The audit findings were now part of the official record. The prosecutor's investigation was underway, and what remained for Harrington to resolve was the specific civil question: did the estate of Thomas Bellamy rightfully belong to Mara Bellamy under the terms of the original will, and was the fraudulent transfer document legally void? Voss argued his case with the same composure he always brought, but she could hear something different in it now, not desperation. Voss was too controlled for that, but a narrowing. His arguments had less room to move than they had at the initial hearing. The audit had closed off the financial angles, Rook's testimony had closed off the document angles, and Pemberton's delay strategy had run out of procedural mechanisms that Harrington was willing to entertain. Harrington ruled at the end of the 2nd day. The transfer document was legally void. It had been executed through fraud and did not represent a legitimate exercise of Thomas Bellamy's intent, as evidenced by the original will, the audit findings contradicting the existence of the claimed debts, and the expert testimony of the attorney who had drafted the will. The estate was to be returned to Mara Bellamy in its entirety. Court protection order would remain in place, until the criminal investigation concluded, at which point any further civil remedies related to the estate's mismanagement would be addressed in subsequent proceedings. He read the ruling in a flat, practical voice that conveyed neither satisfaction nor judgment, just the weight of a decision made on the basis of evidence. Mara sat at the claimant's table and heard the words and did not cry, and did not visibly react beyond a slow, steady breath. She had trained herself out of public reaction over the past 2 months, not because she didn't feel things, but because in a room full of men who were already watching her for signs of being too emotional to be credible, any visible feeling would be noted and used. She had learned that from watching Voss, who never showed anything, and had decided it was at least one thing she could take from him. Stood when Harrington concluded and gathered her documents. Parks shook her hand with genuine warmth. Voss across the room was speaking to Pemberton in a low voice and did not acknowledge her. Gideon had not been present for the ruling. His attorneys had represented him, which told her that his legal team had known which way this was going and had advised him not to be in the room for it. She walked out. Cole was in the corridor. He looked at her face and said, "Well, it's mine," she said. He let out a breath, not a dramatic one, just the breath of a man who had been holding something and was allowed to put it down. All of it, all of it. She stopped walking. Her knee, which had never quite stopped reminding her of the blizzard, sent its familiar complaint up from the old cold injury, and she shifted her weight slightly and ignored it the way she always did. Criminal investigation continues. That's separate. The ranch is mine. Cole nodded. He looked at the wall, then at the floor, then at her. Then you can go home, he said. She registered the word. Home. The ranch, 12 miles outside a small town in Wyoming, which she had fled in the dark 2 months ago, with a strong box under her arm and $43 in her coat. She could go back to it. She had the legal right to walk through its door now, to sit at her father's desk, to open whatever she found there and begin the work of understanding what Gideon had left behind. She should feel purely glad about that. What she actually felt was more complicated, the specific weight of return. The knowledge that going back to the place where everything had happened would require reckoning with things she had been able to set aside while the legal fight consumed her attention. Her father's absence from that house. The version of it she'd grown up in set against the version she was walking back into. And underneath that, a quieter complication she was only beginning to find words for. What about you, she said. Cole looked at her. What about me? When I go home, she said, what do you do? He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just measuring. Go back to my place, he said. Work the spring, see what the year looks like. She nodded. That was a reasonable answer. It was also a completely uninformative one, and she suspected he knew that, and she suspected he was leaving the space deliberately, because Cole Mercer was not the kind of man who put words in other people's mouths or pushed a conversation into territory the other person wasn't ready for. She appreciated that about him. She also found it occasionally maddening. The Halverson Trail, she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. What about it? He said. If you cleared it, she said carefully, and it cut 2 hours off the ride between your property and mine, that would make it a reasonable afternoon trip. You could come for supper and make it back before dark. He looked at her. Steady, direct, no particular hurry. That would depend, he said, on whether supper was on offer. She held his gaze. I'm a decent cook, she said, when I have access to my own kitchen. Corner of his mouth moved again. More definitely this time. I'll look at the trail in the spring, he said. She nodded. She started walking again. He fell into step beside her, the way he always did without fanfare, without comment, just present. She was aware of him at her right side the way she'd been aware of him since the ice crossing, since the courthouse step, since 47 days of supper at Mrs. Aldrich's table. The specific awareness of a person who has become part of the landscape of your days without quite announcing when that happened. She thought about her father, about the conversation she would not be able to have with him, the one where she'd tell him what she'd found in the parlor that night, what she'd done, where she'd ended up. She thought about what he might say, knowing Thomas Bellamy's particular combination of practical sense and quiet feeling for the things that mattered. She thought he would have liked Cole. She thought he would have been relieved that, when she'd had nothing and needed somewhere to Titchell put herself, knocked on a door and found it opening. They reached the street. The Cheyenne afternoon was cold and gray, the same as it had been for most of the 2 months she'd spent in this city, and the ordinary traffic of the place moved around them without interest. Somewhere in the city, Victor Voss was beginning the work of managing whatever came next in the criminal proceedings. A assembling the best possible defense for a man with a second set of ledgers and $60,000 of missing money, and no good explanation for either. Somewhere north, in a house that was hers now legally, officially, beyond anyone's ability to dispute, the spring work was coming and the land was waiting, and the practical reality of managing a recovered ranch with depleted resources and complicated record was going to present itself with the unrelenting specificity that practical realities always did. She had things to do. She had always had things to do. Standing on that street with the ruling in her strongbox and the cold against her face and Cole Mercer at her shoulder, she allowed herself, briefly, to feel the full weight of what 2 months had cost her and what they had given her. She had come into this with nothing but the truth and the stubbornness to carry it. Still had both, and she had the ranch. And she was not yet entirely sure what to call it, the thing that had grown between two people who had been thrown into close quarters by extremity and had discovered, with some surprise, they preferred each other's presence to its absence, but she had that too, whatever it was. Ready? Cole said. She looked at the road north. Yes, she said, and she meant it in more ways than one. She rode back to the ranch on a Tuesday, not because Tuesday meant anything particular, but because that was the day the weather broke, and the roads north were passable, and Parks had finished the final transfer paperwork, and there was nothing left in Cheyenne that required her to stay. Cole rode beside her. They left before 7 in the morning, and neither of them talked much for the first 2 hours, which had become the comfortable pattern of people who have spent enough time together that silence doesn't need to be filled. The landscape was different than it had been in December. Not warm, it was late February, and Wyoming in late February had not yet decided to commit to anything, but the quality of the cold was different, less absolute. The sky had some movement in it. The snow in the lower elevations had compressed and crusted, and in places had pulled back from the south-facing slopes enough to show the brown earth underneath, which in this part of the territory was as close to a promise as nature generally offered. Mara watched the terrain the way she always watched terrain. She knew well, not for information, because she knew what was here, but for the small changes that told you what the season was doing and where it was going. She had grown up reading this land. Even after 2 months in Cheyenne, it came back immediately, the specific literacy of a place that had been home her entire life. She didn't know yet what she would feel when she arrived. She found out when the ranch came into view from the last rise before the property line, the roof line first, then the main structure, then the outbuildings arranged the way her father had arranged them, the way she had grown up knowing them. It was smaller than her memory insisted it should be, the way places always are when you return to them after absence. The winter had not been kind to the exterior. There were things that needed attention, repairs deferred during Gideon's tenure that had accumulated visibly. A section of fence along the east pasture was down. The main barn's north-facing wall had a long weathered streak where a board had warped. She saw all of it. She also saw the cottonwood at the edge of the yard, the one her father had planted when she was 4 years old, barely wider than his arm at the time, now a substantial tree with a spread that covered a good portion of the yard in summer. It was bare now, which was appropriate for February, but it was there, unmoved, indifferent to everything that had happened around it. She stopped remnant at the top of the rise. Cole stopped beside her. He looked at the ranch, then he looked at her. She didn't say anything for a moment. She wasn't sure she had anything to say. The feeling moving through her was not simple, not pure relief, not pure grief, not the clean, triumphant arrival she might have scripted for herself if she'd been scripting things. It was the complicated, genuine feeling of coming back to a place that had hurt you and that you loved anyway, the specific tangle of those two things. Ready? Cole said. He was using the same word he'd used outside the courthouse, with the same lack of pressure in it. Getting there, she said. She put her heels to remnant and rode down. The house was cold inside empty houses. In Wyoming, winters went cold fast and stayed that way, but the structure was sound. She walked through it slowly, not rushing, not cataloging damage, just moving from room to room with the deliberate pace of someone re-establishing a relationship with a place. Kitchen, the parlor, the back room where her father had kept his books, the bedrooms. Everywhere she went, the light came in through windows that were her father's windows, fell on floors that were her father's floors. Gideon had not damaged it. That was the first thing she noticed with any practical clarity. Whatever else he had done, he had not taken apart the house, had not removed things, had not, as she had half feared, gutted the place of anything that wasn't nailed down. The furniture was where it had always been. Her father's chair was still in the parlor, stopped in the doorway of the parlor for a moment, looking at that chair. 2.5 months ago, Gideon had been sitting in it with a whiskey and a forged document and a patience built on the certainty that she had nowhere to go. She walked to it and stood beside it and put her hand on the back of it, the way you put your hand on a person's shoulder, briefly, to let them know you're there. Then she went to the study. The false panel at the bottom of the wardrobe was exactly as she'd left it open, empty. The strongbox she'd taken long gone and no replacement in its place. Gideon had found it, of course. She'd known he would. She'd taken everything that mattered before he could. Closed the panel. She sat down behind the desk. Her father's desk, the same desk he'd sat at to write the feed orders and the letters to the bank and the seasonal account she had helped him keep since she was 14. The surface of it was plain and worn, in the specific places where his hands had rested, where the pen had moved, where the lamp had stood. She ran her hand across it and felt the worn wood under her palm and thought about her father writing his will at a desk in Elias Rook's office 2 years before he died, in the full knowledge that his health was uncertain and his brother was more present in the ranch's operations than he had ever been before. Had he known? Even then, had he suspected something? She would never know. That was one of the losses she was learning to carry, not the dramatic losses, but the specific ones. Conversations she couldn't have, the questions she couldn't ask. She sat behind the desk for a long time. Cole, she was aware, had not followed her inside immediately. He'd taken the horses to the barn, checked on what was there, done the practical things that needed doing. When he did come in, he went to the kitchen, and she heard him building a fire in the stove, a necessary task, because the house needed warming before anything else was going to be comfortable. And he did it without announcing it, without asking if it was all right, simply doing the useful thing. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. He appeared in the doorway of the study a while later, looked at her behind the desk. Didn't say anything. He used to let me sit here when I was small, she said, while he worked. He had a habit of explaining what he was doing while he did it, not teaching me, exactly, not formally, talking through it, like he was thinking out loud and I happened to be there. She looked at the desk surface. I learned most of what I know about keeping books that way, just by listening. Cole leaned against the doorframe. Sounds like he was teaching you, he said, just quietly. Yes. She thought about that. Yes, I suppose he was. She looked up at him. He would have sent me to you, she said. If he'd known I was going to need somewhere to go. He would have said, find someone honest, find someone who knows the land, find someone who doesn't make things more complicated than they are. He would have described you and not known he was describing you. Cole was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure I'm easy to recommend, he said. You're not easy, she agreed, but you're honest. And you know the land. She paused. And you don't make things more complicated than they are. 3 for 3. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest he reliably got to one. She had learned to recognize it. Fire's going, he said. Kitchen will be warm in an hour. She stood up from the desk. She was not done sitting there. She would sit there many times in the coming weeks and months, working through what needed working through. But she was done for today, and there were things to do. She had a ranch to take back. The spring came in slow and grudging, the way Wyoming springs always did, not a clean arrival, but an extended negotiation, cold and warmth trading territory back and forth for weeks before warmth finally committed. Mara spent those weeks in a state of sustained practical effort that suited her better than waiting ever had. There was always the next thing. Harlan Briggs came back in the first week of March, along with his eldest son, a young man of 17 who was quiet in the same way his father was quiet, but had good hands and a willingness to be told things. She hired them both without deliberating about it. She sent word to 2 other hands she'd known under her father, men who'd left the ranch during Gideon's tenure, for reasons she could now guess at, and both of them came back within the month. Fence along the east pasture was repaired in the 2nd week. The barn wall was addressed in the 3rd. She found a list of deferred maintenance items in the study, written in her father's hand and then added to in a different hand. She didn't recognize one of Gideon's people. She assumed, who had known there were problems and had made no effort to address them. She worked through the list methodically, prioritizing by what would cost her most if it failed first. Cole came twice in March, not for supper exactly, or not only for supper. He helped with the fence repair on the first visit, working alongside Harlan with the uncomplicated ease of a man who is accustomed to physical labor and doesn't require acknowledgement of it. On the 2nd visit, he looked at the barn wall and told her what he thought the underlying issue was, and was right, which saved her a repair that would have addressed the symptom instead of the problem. He did not stay long either time. He had his own spring work calving, fencing, the accumulated winter-deferred tasks of his own property, and he returned to the Ridge Ranch each evening without making an event of it. But the Halverson Trail, she noticed the second time he came, had been worked on. The worst of the overgrowth had been cleared. The footing through the difficult stretch was improved. It was not finished, but it was underway. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. They both knew it was being done. In the first week of April, Parks sent word from Cheyenne that the territorial prosecutor had formally filed criminal charges against Gideon Bellamy, 7 counts, covering the range of misconduct the audit had documented, from the forged transfer document through the financial diversions to the fraudulent property transfers. Voss had withdrawn as Gideon's personal attorney, citing a conflict of interest that Mara suspected was really Voss's professional calculation that association with the losing case was no longer in his interest. She read the charges letter at her father's desk and held it for a long time. She had imagined this moment differently at various points over the preceding months. She had imagined feeling large things: vindication, relief, the particular satisfaction of watch something be named correctly after months of it being called something else. What she actually felt was quieter than that, more like setting something down that you've been carrying so long that you'd forgotten it was separate from you. Gideon would face the prosecutor's case in the territorial court. It would take time. These things always took time, and the outcome was not guaranteed, because no outcome in a courtroom was guaranteed. And Gideon still had money and connections, even with his accounts partially frozen. Voss was gone, but Pemberton remained, and Pemberton was skilled at what he did. She would testify when called. Parks would manage the civil remedies that remained: the recovery of the diverted funds, the reversal of the fraudulent property transfers. Those proceedings would overlap with the criminal case and would extend probably through the fall. She had made her peace with more time. She had not arrived at that peace easily, but she'd arrived at it. What she could not control, she had learned to track without letting it consume her. What she could control, she worked on. That division, the clearest lesson of the past 4 months, had become the organizing principle of her days. Cole came in April on a Thursday, and this time it was in the late morning rather than the afternoon, which told her he'd left his place early to have more time. She was in the pasture with Harlan when he arrived, working through the initial assessment of what the cattle situation looked like after winter, and she saw him come up the road and lifted a hand, and he lifted one back, and she finished the conversation with Harlan before walking over. He was at the fence, looking at the repaired section, when she reached him. "Held up well," he said. "Harlan does good work," she said. He nodded. He looked at the pasture, at the cattle moving in the thin April sun, at the general state of a ranch that had been through a hard year and was coming back from it, slowly, on the terms the land set, rather than the terms anyone would have preferred. "Spring's coming," he said. "Finally," she said. He turned and looked at her with the directness she'd grown accustomed to over the months, the look that didn't perform anything, that just looked. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I don't know how to say things any other way." She waited. "I've been coming over here twice a month because I wanted to," he said. "Not because the fence needed looking at, not because the barn wall needed a second opinion, because I wanted to be here." He looked at the pasture briefly and then back at her. "I'm not good at this. I know that. I've been alone long enough that I've probably forgotten how most of it works. But I know what it feels like to want to be somewhere, and this is where I want to be." The April wind moved through the pasture and the cattle moved with it. The ordinary sounds of a working ranch in the middle of a morning carrying on around them, indifferent to what was being said between two people at the fence line. Mara looked at him. She had known this was coming in the way you know. Weather is coming, not the specific hour, but the direction. She had known it for a while and had been thinking about it in the spaces between everything else. In the evenings when the day's work was done and the house was quiet and she was alone with whatever she actually felt when she stopped managing what she felt. She had tried to think about it practically, because practical was how she thought about most things. Complications were real: 2 properties, 2 sets of responsibilities, specific difficulties of building anything between people who had already built substantial separate lives and who both had the particular self-sufficiency of people who had spent years managing alone. She had thought about all of that honestly, without talking herself out of it or into it. What she kept coming back to was simpler than the complications. She thought about the morning she'd woken up in his house and found her boots by the fire and her coat on the peg, and the knowledge that a man she didn't know had done small, careful things to make her less uncomfortable while she slept, without asking for anything in return and without making a point of it. She thought about the ice crossing and the way he'd said, "I'm sorry," without being asked. She thought about 47 days in a boarding house and the fact that he had stayed. She thought about all the things he had done without making them large, because Cole Mercer made nothing large. That was his particular way of being in the world. And what she had slowly come to understand was that the size of a thing and the reality of it were not the same. He had done real things quietly, consistently, without requiring her to notice them in any particular way. She had noticed them. "Cole," she said, he waited. "I spent 4 months fighting to get back something that was already mine," she said. "I walked into a blizzard and fell down more times than I can count, and argued with lawyers, and slept on a narrow bed in a boarding house, and learned what it actually costs to make the truth stick when powerful. People have decided it's inconvenient." She paused. "None of that was easy, and almost none of it went the way I planned. But I knew what I was fighting for the whole time. I knew what the end of it looked like, and now," he said. "And now I don't know exactly what the end looks like," she said. Which she gestured between them, which was not very articulate, but communicated what she meant. "I don't have a ledger for this. I can't account for it in columns." "No," he agreed, "but I want you here," she said. "Not because I need help with the fence. I have Harlan for the fence." She looked at him directly. "I want you here because when you're not here, the morning feels like something's been miscounted. Like there's a number that should be in the ledger and isn't, and the whole thing doesn't balance right." She paused. "That's probably not very romantic." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then that almost smile arrived, more fully than usual. "No," he said, "but it's honest. Everything I do is honest," she said. "Gets me in considerable trouble." "I know," he said. "I was there for some of it." She laughed. It was not a carefully managed laugh. It was the involuntary kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere past the managed layers, and it surprised her the way it had surprised her in Mrs. Aldrich's kitchen months ago. The reminder that her body still knew how to do this, that the past 5 months of difficulty had not actually taken that away. She put her hand over her mouth and then dropped it, because there was no reason to stop it. Cole was smiling. Not the shadow of it, not the corner of the mouth version. An actual smile, which she had seen perhaps twice in all the months she'd known him, and which changed his face in a way that made her realize she was going to want to see it regularly. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without preamble, without build-up, just the thing itself. "I don't think I need to say it in a more elaborate way than that." She looked at him. "I love you too," she said. "And no, you don't." He nodded, as if that were settled, as if that were a practical matter that had been correctly resolved, and they could now move on to the next item. "2 properties," he said. "Yes. That's a management problem." "Yes. The Halverson Trail will help. But it doesn't resolve the question of where." "Cole," she put her hand on his arm. He stopped. "One decision at a time," she said. "That's what you told me in December. You said we'd figure it out one decision at a time." He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her. "I did say that," he said. "Then let's start there." Put his hand over hers on the fence rail. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand over another hand, the specific warmth of it, the simple weight. She felt it all the way up her arm and didn't say anything about it. They stood at the fence and looked at the pasture for a while, and the cattle moved in the thin spring sun, and somewhere behind them, the house that was hers sat in the April light, and the cottonwood at the edge of the yard was beginning, barely, to think about budding. The criminal proceedings against Gideon Bellamy concluded that fall. The territorial court found him guilty on 5 of the 7 counts, acquitting on 2 that hinged on evidence the prosecutor had not been able to fully establish to the court's satisfaction. He received a sentence of 4 years in the territorial penitentiary, reduced to 3 given his age, and a character attestation from a former business associate that Mara had not been able to counter, which she had known she wouldn't be able to counter, and had made her peace with before the verdict was read. 3 years, not 4. He would serve his time and emerge at 62 into a world where his reputation was thoroughly destroyed. His assets had been largely forfeited or seized, and the name Gideon Bellamy carried the specific weight that names carry when they've been attached publicly to fraud and theft and the betrayal of a dead brother's trust. She had wanted more. She had known she might not get more. She sat in the gallery of the court when the verdict was read and held herself still and accepted what the system had delivered, which was not everything but was something and was real and was on the record. Victor Voss was separately investigated by the territorial bar for his role in preparing the fraudulent documentation. He was not criminally charged. The evidence of his direct knowledge of the forgery was insufficiently specific to clear the prosecutor's threshold, but the bar inquiry resulted in a censure and a formal finding against him. which meant his practice in Wyoming territory was effectively finished. He relocated, Parks told her afterward, to Colorado. Pemberton moved on to his next client. The diverted funds, the $60,000 figure the audit had identified, were only partially recoverable. Some had already been spent. Some had passed through enough intermediary accounts that the legal recovery was expensive and uncertain relative to the amount. After the court-ordered forfeiture of what could be seized and the legal costs of the civil recovery, Mara recovered roughly $38,000 in actual money and assets, plus the reversal of the 3 fraudulent property transfers, which returned the adjacent parcels to the estate. $38,000. More than she'd expected, given the nature of fraud recovery, and less than what had actually been taken, and a number she looked at for a long time on the evening. Parks sent the final accounting. Her father had spent 30 years building the Bellamy Ranch. Gideon had spent 2.5 years taking from it. The taking would never be fully undone, in money or in anything else. That was the honest accounting. She sat with it. Then she put the number in the ledger and moved on to the next entry. The Halverson Trail was finished in June. Cole said nothing about it being finished. He simply came over one Tuesday morning in June, and the ride took notably less time than it had in April, and she noticed and said so. Done, he said. I see that, still rough in one section. It'll smooth out with use, she said. He looked at her. Probably, he said. He came on Tuesdays after that, more often than not. Sometimes Thursdays, too. She stopped thinking of it as his visits to her ranch and started thinking of it as him being around, which was different in a way she couldn't have defined precisely, but that she felt accurately. She had stopped feeling like the ranch was a thing she was managing alone. That was new, not the practical help. Harlan and his son, on the other hand, handled the practical help, and she directed them with the confidence that came from years of knowing exactly what a working ranch required. It was something else. Something about ending the day in a kitchen with another person's coffee cup on the table and another person's boots by the door, and the knowledge that in the morning there would be a voice in the conversation. She hadn't realized she'd missed that. She had been alone in various ways for long enough that alone had normalized. It had stopped feeling like something absent and started feeling like the simple condition of things. She understood now that she had been wrong about that. Cole brought Cobb over in August to help with the hay-cutting. His own work had paused for the week, and it made sense to move the extra pair of hands where they were needed, which happened to be her place. Cobb turned out to be a taciturn man in his 40s, who did good work without needing direction, and who regarded Mara with the careful respect of someone who had heard the outline of the past year's events and had drawn his own conclusions about the kind of person she was. On the third evening, eating at her kitchen table, the most people it had held in years, Cobb said, without particular preamble, "You're going to need another hand through the winter." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about Harlan's second son. He'll be 15 in the fall." Cobb looked at Cole. Cole looked at his food and said nothing, which was a kind of conversation between them that she had stopped trying to fully translate. "The two places together make sense," Cobb said, stating a fact. "Not an opinion, not a suggestion. A fact, I know," she said again. Cole looked up from his food. He looked at her with the specific directness that she loved, that she had loved since before she'd known she loved it. The look that didn't dress itself up. She looked back at him with the same thing, or her version of it. "One decision at a time," she said. Cole put down his fork. "Marry me," he said. "Not will you marry me? Not I'd like to ask you something. Just the thing itself, stated plainly. The way he stated everything, and put down on the table between them, like a number in a ledger. Here is what I want. Written down. Verifiable." Cobb examined the ceiling with intense interest. Mara looked at Cole. She thought about a night in December when she had knocked on a door with nothing but the truth under her arm and a busted knee and no plan beyond the next 3 feet, and a man had opened that door and stepped aside and let her through. She thought about everything that had been built since then, not easily, not cleanly, not without cost, and about the specific quality of a thing that had been built under pressure and had not cracked. She thought about her father, who had loved her mother, the way practical people love deeply, without making a performance of it, steadily, in the evidence of daily choices, in the way he'd talked about her years after she was gone. She thought about what he would say if he were here, sitting at this table listening to a man ask his daughter that particular question in that particular way. She thought he would probably say, "Well, are you going to answer him?" "Yes," she said. Cobb found something else to examine. Cole nodded one nod, the way you acknowledge a calculation that has come out correctly. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in his, The same way he'd covered her hand on the fence rail in April, without ceremony, without drama, just the weight of it. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a moment, while the August evening came down outside and the kitchen was warm, and Cobb made a point of finishing his supper with great efficiency and excusing himself, and the ranch sat around them in the particular quiet of a working place at the end of a working day. The Bellamy Ranch and the Mercer Ridge property were not formally consolidated immediately. These things took time, legal arrangements, practical adjustments, the specific negotiation of two people who had each built independent lives, deciding how to build a shared one without sacrificing what had made either of them who they were. They worked through it the way they worked through most things, one decision at a time, without rushing the ones that needed to sit, without avoiding the ones that needed to be made. Some decisions were easy. Cole moved the majority of his winter operation to the Bellamy Ranch, which had the better facilities for the herd size they were working toward. Mara kept the Ridge property active as a secondary operation and went up there with Cole once a month to manage what needed managing. The Halverson Trail was used so regularly that by October it had become genuinely smooth, which she found satisfying in a way that was partly practical and partly not. Some decisions were harder. There were arguments, not many, but real ones, the kind that come when two people with strong opinions and independent habits try to navigate the specific frictions of a shared life. She had opinions about how the books should be kept. He had opinions about how the herd should be managed. Neither of them was wrong, exactly, and neither of them was entirely right, and working out which parts of each position deserved to survive. The collision was sometimes exhausting and occasionally maddening, and always, in the end, arrived at something better than either of them had started with. They were married in the spring, in the front room of her father's house, with Harlan Briggs and his family present, and Elias Rook, who had made the trip from Casper specifically, and who sat through the whole proceeding with the expression of a man who had witnessed many important moments in his career, and was quietly glad to have lived long enough to witness this one. Parks came from Cheyenne. Cobb came. Pete, the stable boy who had given Mara directions on the worst night of her life, was 17 now and had been brought by his father at Mara's specific request. He arrived with the self-conscious dignity of a boy, on the edge of becoming something, and when she shook his hand at the door she said, "You kept your head and you knew the land, and you told me the truth when it mattered. You should know that." He went red to the ears and found a place to stand against the wall, and she could see him carrying the knowledge of it, which was what she'd intended. Stood in front of the people who had been part of this, who had ridden hard and told the truth, and stayed when they could have walked away. And she said her piece to Cole, and he said his, without elaboration, in the plain, honest language of two people who meant what they said and did not require anything more decorative than that. She had not replaced her father. She had never been trying to replace her father. She understood that now, in a way, she hadn't understood that first morning when she'd sat behind his desk and put her hand on its worn surface. She was not Thomas Belsamy's replacement. She was the person he had been building all those years when he explained the ledgers while she sat in the corner and talked through the decisions while she listened. He had been making her capable of exactly what she had done, not because he knew she would need to, but because he wanted her to be able to handle whatever she needed to handle. She had handled it. She had not handled it perfectly. She had fallen in the snow more times than she could count. She had misjudged Gideon, had trusted his composure in the early days of the legal fight, when she should have been more suspicious of it. She had needed help, real help, the kind you can't provide for yourself, the kind that requires someone else to show up, and she had been fortunate enough to find it. And she had been honest enough with herself to accept it when it came. That was not weakness. She had thought for most of her life that needing help was a form of weakness. She had watched her father refuse help for years, out of pride and the specific pride of the self-made, and she had inherited the tendency. Walking into that blizzard had not cured it exactly, but it had corrected it. You could refuse help out of pride and die in the snow, or you could knock on a stranger's doors and say, "I have the truth, and I need somewhere to put myself." And if you were lucky, the door would open. She had been lucky. She was also aware that luck was not the whole of it. Luck had been the part that put Cole Mercer's light in that window. She had walked 8 miles to reach it. That was her. She thought about all the women she knew, women in this territory and everywhere else, women who had been told that what they owned was not really theirs, that what they knew was not really reliable. The rooms they walked into were not rooms they had earned access to. She thought about how many of them had signed the paper, not because they were weaker than she was, But because they had not had a Pete with directions, had not had a strong box of evidence, had not had whatever combination of stubbornness and luck and specific knowledge had allowed her to get out of that parlor with the truth intact. She thought about that, and she did not feel superior to those women. She felt the weight of the obligation it created. She intended to be useful about it. She didn't know yet exactly how, but she had the ranch now, and a working operation, and a name that had been cleared publicly, and a certain amount of credibility in the territory that had been bought at a known price. She intended to spend it on something worth buying. One decision at a time. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that tests what you've actually built together, as opposed to what you imagined you'd built. Cold sustained a late coming that dragged into April. They lost 2 calves and a section of the new north fence, and 3 weeks in February to illness that moved through the household, starting with one of Harlan's boys and working its way through everyone, including Cole, who was a difficult patient in the specific way of men who are accustomed to being physically capable and find incapacity insulting. She managed the ranch through that 3 weeks, with Harlan's help, in the way she managed most things by finding the next task and doing it. When Cole was well enough to be up and around, he came out to find the books in order, and the cattle accounted for, and the fence repair scheduled, and he looked at all of it with an expression she had learned to read, which was the expression of a man who was not surprised but was genuinely glad. "You didn't need me for any of that," he said. "No," she said. "Then, why? Because I wanted you," she said. "Not because I needed saving." She looked at him with the same directness he had always looked at her with. "That's a different thing. You know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I know that." She picked up the ledger and went back to work. Outside, the Wyoming winter went on about its business, indifferent and beautiful and demanding, the way it always had been, and would be regardless of what happened inside the house, at the edge of the yard where the cottonwood stood, still bare, still there, still marking the ground where a man had planted it decades ago in the faith that something was worth growing. The land does not care how much money you have. It cares how much you show up. Her father had said that. She had believed it then, in the way you believe things you've been told by someone you trust. She believed it now in the way you believe things you have tested against reality and found to be accurate. Show up, tell the truth, don't sign the lie, and when someone opens the door in the dark, walk in. That was not a simple lesson. It had cost something to learn it. Cost her a blizzard and a busted knee and 2 months in a boarding house and 47 days of counting and all the grinding, unglamorous work of making the truth stick when powerful people had decided it was inconvenient. It had cost her the specific innocence of believing that family meant safety. It had cost her some of the easy faith that justice arrives because it should. But what she had now was not nothing. She had her father's ranch, running again under her name. She had her father's ledger in the records of the territorial court, her father's will on file, her father's name cleared in every proceeding that had come for it. She had Cole Mercer, who had opened a door in the dark and never asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was, not smaller, not simpler, not more manageable, not less. A man who had stayed when staying cost him, who had made things easy when he could, and didn't pretend it was nothing when he couldn't, who loved her in the way practical people love deeply, steadily, in the evidence of daily choices, without making a production of it. She had a home. Not just the house, not just the walls and the floors and the cottonwood in the yard. The home that is made of people who choose to be present, who tell the truth to each other, who do the work and don't require it to look like anything other than work. The home that no one can forge your signature to take away from you because it is not written on paper. It lives in the specific daily, imperfect, real fabric of what 2 people build when they decide to build it, honestly. She had fought for her father's land. She had not expected, walking into that blizzard, to find anything else. She had found everything else. And on an ordinary evening in the 2nd year of her marriage, sitting at her father's desk with the books in order and the fire going, and Cole's boots by the kitchen door and the sound of the ranch settling into the night around her, Mara Mercer picked up the pen and opened the ledger to the next clean page and began.